Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the low doorway of a medieval tailor's shop, and I need you to understand something right from the start. This isn't some quaint historical fantasy where you're humming while stitching pretty dresses. You're about to enter a freezing, cramped workshop that smells like wet wool, body odor, and desperation, where your fingers will bleed daily, your back will scream in agony, and your career begins with 7 years of unpaid servitude that might actually kill you before you ever get to call yourself a real tailor. The romance dies fast when you realize the fabric you're touching has been soaked in human urine. The needle you're holding will snap and stab through your fingernail at least twice this week, and the master tailor watching your every move has the legal right to beat you for working too slowly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing this little community spread across the globe. Some of you probably tucked in at midnight. Others may be catching this during your lunch break on the other side of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 4:30 in the morning, and you're not waking up to an alarm clock. Those don't exist yet. You're waking up because your body has been trained through months of painful conditioning to jolt awake in the freezing darkness. Your breath forming clouds in the unheated attic space above the tailor's shop where you sleep on a straw mattress you share with 2 other apprentices. One of them is coughing again, that wet, rattling sound that's been getting worse for weeks, and you know exactly what that means, but nobody talks about it. The workshop below is already creaking with movement. Master Wilhelm is awake, which means you're already late. You scramble down the narrow ladder in the pitch darkness, your feet finding the rungs through muscle memory because there's no candle to waste on simply getting out of bed. The workshop is barely warmer than the street outside. There's no central heating, obviously, and the fire in the hearth won't be lit for another hour because firewood costs money and Master Wilhelm watches every single penny like a dragon guarding gold. You're wearing the same wool tunic you've worn for 3 months straight. Washing clothes is a luxury that happens maybe 4 times a year, and you're not due for another wash until Easter, which is 2 months away. The fabric is stiff with dried sweat and grime, and it scratches against your skin as you move through the darkness toward your workstation. Your first task, every single morning, is to prepare the workshop for the day ahead. This means sweeping the floor of fabric scraps and dust, organizing the tools that were left scattered yesterday, and most importantly, getting the good light ready. Medieval tailoring is precision work, and you can't do precision work in darkness, so you're responsible for positioning the workshop's most valuable asset, the window space. Master Wilhelm's shop is actually fortunate enough to have 2 glass windows, which is practically a luxury in 1340s London. Most tailor shops make do with oiled parchment or cloth coverings that let in watery, filtered light. But glass? Glass means Master Wilhelm serves quality clientele, and quality clientele means impossible standards you'll fail to meet approximately 6 times before noon. You're positioning the large cutting table directly under the biggest window when you hear the master descending the stairs from his private chamber above. Master Wilhelm is 47 years old, which makes him practically ancient by medieval standards. Most men don't see 40. He's survived this long because tailoring, despite its brutality, is slightly less deadly than being a mason or a blacksmith or a soldier. His hands are gnarled and scarred, his back is permanently hunched from decades of bending over workbenches, and his eyes are starting to fail, which is why he needs apprentices like you to do the close detail work he can no longer manage. But historians still argue whether the master-apprentice system was primarily educational or simply economic exploitation dressed up as mentorship. You're slow this morning. Master Wilhelm observes in Middle English that your modern ears would find nearly incomprehensible, but you've been here 9 months, so you understand his particular accent and vocabulary. He's not wrong, you are slow. You were up until nearly midnight last night finishing the hem on a merchant's overcoat because the merchant's wife changed her mind about the length for the 3rd time. You got maybe 4 hours of sleep, and 4 hours becomes your generous nights. Most nights you're lucky to get 3. The master moves to the hearth and begins the elaborate process of starting the day's fire. He's using a flint and steel, striking them together over a small nest of charcloth and dried moss until finally, after what feels like 5 full minutes of striking, a tiny ember glows. He nurses this ember with the concentration of a man performing surgery, because if this fire goes out during the day, someone, probably you, will be sent to a neighbor's house to beg for hot coals to restart it, which is humiliating and time-consuming. The fire is essential not just for heat, but for the pressing irons you'll need later. Medieval tailors don't have steam irons or electric presses. You have chunks of iron that you heat in the fire until they're almost red-hot, then press against fabric with nothing but your own judgment preventing you from scorching expensive material or, more commonly, burning your own hands. As the fire reluctantly comes to life, you're joined by the other two apprentices. There's Thomas, who's 15 and has been here for 3 years already, which makes him your senior and gives him the authority to order you around and criticize your work. Then there's Peter, who's 12 and arrived just 2 months ago. Peter is currently learning that medieval apprenticeship isn't like going to school. There are no classes, no textbooks, no patient explanations. You learn by watching, by trying, by failing, and by getting hit when your failures cost the master money. Peter's hands are covered in needle punctures and small cuts. His fingers still soft and unpracticed. Your hands looked like that 9 months ago. Now your fingertips have developed thick calluses, and you've learned to barely feel the needle pricks that happen dozens of times per day. The workshop itself is roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, smaller than most modern living rooms, and it serves as retail space, production facility, and basically the master's entire business empire. The front wall features a wide wooden counter that opens directly onto the street. During business hours, this counter will be folded down to display finished garments and fabric samples to passers-by. Medieval shops don't have doors you walk through into a separate retail space. You conduct business right at the street level with the workshop visible behind you, which means customers can watch you work and make comments about how you're doing it wrong. It's basically like having your office directly on the sidewalk while strangers critique your every move. The walls are lined with shelves holding bolts of fabric in various stages of preparation. And here's something nobody tells you about medieval textiles. They're astonishingly heavy. A full bolt of Goodwill cloth weighs maybe 30 or 40 pounds, and you're expected to lift these, carry them, unroll them, and manipulate them constantly throughout the day. Your back and shoulders are developing muscles you didn't know existed, and they ache constantly with a deep, grinding pain that never completely goes away. You'll work through this pain for the next 7 years until your apprenticeship is complete, and then, if you survive and if you can afford the exorbitant guild fees, you'll maybe possibly get to become a journeyman tailor who gets to work through the same pain while getting paid slightly more than nothing. Master Wilhelm is now explaining today's priorities, and you're learning the wonderful truth about medieval business. Nothing is ever simple. There's a wool cape for Alderman Fitzwalter that needs to be finished by this afternoon. Wool that's been fulled and stretched and dyed a deep blue that cost more than you'll earn in 2 years. There's a linen shirt for Father Benedict at St. Mary's Church that requires especially fine work because priests are picky about their undergarments and they pay reliably, which makes them priority customers. There's a pile of mending work from various customers. Torn seams, replaced buttons, adjusted waistlines, which is the bread and butter work that actually keeps the shop profitable but which is soul-crushingly tedious. And there's a completely new commission that arrived yesterday. A merchant named Hugh wants an entirely new outfit for his daughter's wedding, complete with an overdress, an underdress, and matching accessories, and he wants it done in 2 weeks, which is absolutely impossible, but Master Wilhelm has already accepted the job because you never, ever turn down paid work. You're assigned to the Alderman's cape, which should feel like an honor, but actually feels like being handed a live bomb. Aldermen are powerful men in medieval London. They're the city's governing council, just below the mayor himself, and they can make or break a tradesman's entire career with a single word. If Alderman Fitzwalter is pleased with his cape, he might recommend Master Wilhelm to other wealthy clients. If he's displeased, if the stitching is uneven, if the drape isn't perfect, if literally anything is slightly wrong, he could spread word that this shop does shoddy work, and in a city where reputation is everything, that's a death sentence for business. No pressure, right? You spread the cape across the cutting table, and even in the dim morning light, you can see its beautiful work. The wool has been fulled to a tight, water-resistant finish, and the blue dye is rich and even, probably woad, maybe with some indigo if the alderman paid premium prices. The cape is cut in the fashionable style of the 1340s, with a wide hood and a length that will fall to mid-calf, and your job is to finish the hem with a decorative stitch that's both functional and attractive. This is detail work, which means you'll be hunched over this table for hours, your neck cramping, your eyes straining in the limited light, making hundreds of tiny, perfect stitches that need to be absolutely uniform in length and tension. You thread your needle, a hand-forged iron needle that cost more than a day's wages and which you guard carefully because losing it means a beating, and you begin to work. The rhythm of sewing is one of the few meditations available in medieval life. In and out, pull the thread through, maintain consistent tension, move forward exactly one stitch length, repeat. Your world narrows to the inch of fabric directly in front of you. The workshop sounds fade into background noise. Thomas arguing with Peter about proper thread tension. Master Wilhelm moving around inspecting various projects. The crackling of the growing fire. The sound of the city waking up outside. Here's a quirky detail that would blow your modern mind. The thread you're using is linen, hand-spun, and it's been waxed with beeswax to give it strength and help it glide through the fabric. But the waxing process isn't some industrial manufacturing procedure. Someone, probably a woman in her home, sat and spun this thread by hand on a drop spindle, then drew it through a small container of beeswax, all while her children played around her feet and she gossiped with neighbors. Every single thread in this entire shop represents hours of human labor before it even reached Master Wilhelm's hands. When you think about medieval clothing this way, you realize that every garment is actually an astonishing investment of human time and effort. That simple peasant tunic represents maybe 40 hours of spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing. A nobleman's fancy outfit? You're looking at hundreds of hours of accumulated labor from multiple craftspeople. By the time the church bells ring for prime, about 6 in the morning by your modern reckoning, your fingers are already tired and you've completed maybe 18 inches of hem. You have approximately 9 feet left to go. The light is getting better as sunrise approaches, which helps, but it also means the workshop is getting colder as the night's accumulated warmth in the stone and timber bleeds away into the winter morning. Your breath is visible and your fingers are going numb, which is genuinely dangerous because numb fingers make mistakes, and mistakes on the alderman's cape are unthinkable. Master Wilhelm notices you flexing your hands to restore circulation and makes a small grunt of approval. "Keep moving," he says. "Stiff hands are slow hands." This is actually decent advice from a man who rarely gives encouragement. The solution is to keep your hands moving constantly, which generates friction heat, and to occasionally breathe on your fingers or tuck them briefly into your armpits for warmth. You can't work directly next to the fire because smoke and ashes would damage the expensive fabric, so you endure. Around 7 o'clock, the shutter comes down and the shop opens for business. The counter folds out onto the street, and suddenly you're aware that everything you do is now visible to the passing public. Medieval London is waking up around you. You can hear vendors calling out their wares, animals being driven to market, the general chaos of urban life. And here's something that's deeply weird about medieval retail. Shops are organized by trade into specific streets or districts. Master Wilhelm's shop is on Threadneedle Street, where basically every building houses a tailor or someone in a related trade. This creates intense competition. There are literally dozens of tailor shops within a 2-minute walk, but it also means customers know exactly where to come when they need clothing made or repaired. Your first interruption comes almost immediately. A woman leans over the counter, examining the cape you're working on with sharp, critical eyes. "Is that for Alderman Fitzwalter?" she asks, and Master Wilhelm smoothly intercepts, moving between you and the customer. This is important. Apprentices don't speak to customers. You're not trusted to represent the business, to negotiate prices, or to make promises about timelines. You're furniture that happens to have useful hands. The master handles all customer interactions while you keep your head down and keep working, trying to ignore the fact that this stranger is probably judging every single stitch you're making. The morning grinds forward. Your stomach is growling because breakfast, a hunk of dark bread and weak ale, won't happen until after 8 o'clock, and even then it'll be a brief pause rather than a proper meal. Medieval workers don't get comfortable break rooms or lunch hours. You eat standing at your workstation quickly, and then immediately return to work because time is literally money and Master Wilhelm is not running a charity. This is your life now. This is every day. 7 years of this, starting before dawn, ending after dark. 6 days a week with only Sunday offering partial relief because even on the Lord's Day there's mending and preparation work to be done. Your hands will permanently curl into a half-flexed position from holding needles. Your back will hunch. Your eyes will strain and weaken from years of close work in poor light. And this is if everything goes well, if you don't get sick, if you don't make an expensive mistake, if the master doesn't decide you're not worth keeping and turns you out onto the street with nothing. Welcome to medieval tailoring. You probably won't survive this. The real terror of your situation doesn't fully hit until the third week, when a man in expensive robes appears at the shop counter and Master Wilhelm's face goes pale. You're hunched over a linen shift, doing basic seam work that a trained monkey could probably manage, when you notice the master practically genuflecting to this visitor. The man wears a heavy gold chain over his burgundy wool surcoat, and pinned to his chest is a badge you're learning to recognize with the same instinctive fear a gazelle develops for lions, the seal of the Tailors' Guild of London. This is Walter Bray, one of the guild wardens, and his job is to make your life spectacularly difficult while claiming it's all for quality control and protecting the dignity of the trade. He's here for a surprise inspection, which happens roughly 4 times a year, and which can destroy a shop's entire livelihood in approximately 15 minutes if the warden decides he doesn't like what he sees. Master Wilhelm is now pulling out every piece of finished and in-progress work for Walter's examination, and you're desperately trying to remember if you've committed any of the approximately 700 offenses that could result in fines, seizure of goods, or outright closure of the business. Here's what nobody tells you about medieval guilds until you're already trapped in the system. They're not cozy fraternal organizations of happy craftsmen supporting each other. They're ruthless monopolies that control every single aspect of your working life, and they extract money from you at every possible opportunity while threatening complete economic destruction if you dare to challenge their authority. The Tailors Guild controls who can legally work as a tailor in London, what techniques you're allowed to use, what hours you can keep your shop open, what you can charge for your work, who you can hire, how many apprentices you can train, and basically every other detail of your professional existence. Step outside these rules even slightly and you're done. Walter Bray is running his fingers along a seam in a wool doublet, and you can see Master Wilhelm sweating despite the cold. This stitching is acceptable, Walter pronounces, which is apparently high praise. He moves to examine a pile of fabric samples. All English wool, I trust? He asks, and here's where things get truly absurd. The guild has rules about what materials you're allowed to use, and they're intensely protectionist about English products. Using imported fabric without special permission? That's a fine. Using techniques that originate from foreign tailors? Another fine. Finishing garments between sunset and sunrise? Believe it or not, also a fine because the guild insists all work must be done in natural daylight to ensure quality, which is theoretically reasonable but practically makes it nearly impossible to meet tight deadlines. All English wool, Master Warden, Wilhelm confirms, and he's not lying. The guild's penalties for using smuggled foreign fabric are severe enough that most tailors don't risk it. But here's the economic trap. English wool is expensive, heavily taxed, and sometimes lower quality than Flemish or Italian alternatives. You're required to use it anyway because the guild is essentially enforcing economic nationalism, protecting English wool producers and dyers at the expense of your profit margins and your customers' choices. Walter picks up the cape you've been working on for Alderman Fitzwalter, and your heart basically stops beating. He examines your hem stitching with the critical eye of a man who spent 30 years in the trade, and you're certain he's going to find the slight irregularity you know exists about 2 feet from the left edge where your hand cramped and one stitch came out slightly longer than the others. That tiny imperfection, invisible to any normal human being, could be grounds for citing the shop for insufficient craftsmanship, which comes with a fine of 5 shillings, roughly half of what Master Wilhelm will earn from the entire Cape Commission. Adequate work for an apprentice, Walter finally says, setting the cape down, and you nearly collapse with relief. Adequate. You'll take adequate. Adequate means you're not being fined, which means you're not getting beaten later for costing the master money, which means you might actually survive until dinner. But Walter's not done. He's now asking to see the shop's guild documentation, and Master Wilhelm hurries to produce a leather-bound ledger that contains the official records of his membership. Every master craftsman must be a full member of the guild, which requires having completed your own apprenticeship, worked as a journeyman for several years, produced a masterpiece, a demonstration garment proving your skill, and paid an entry fee that's typically around £2 to £3. which is roughly what a skilled worker might earn in an entire year. Master Wilhelm paid his entry fee 17 years ago, and he's been paying annual guild dues ever since, currently about 8 shillings per year, plus additional fees for various privileges, like the right to train apprentices. Oh, and speaking of apprentices, there's a fee for that too. Every apprentice must be officially registered with the guild, and there's an enrollment fee of about 40 shillings per apprentice. Your parents paid this when they indentured you to Master Wilhelm, along with probably another pound or two in gifts and considerations to make sure the master would actually teach you properly instead of just using you as free labor. So before you even walked through the workshop door, your family invested the equivalent of maybe 2 years' wages in your future career. No pressure to succeed or anything. It's not like your entire family's financial stability is riding on you not failing. Walter is now flipping through the ledger, checking that all fees are current. Your quarterly guild assessment is due in 3 weeks, he reminds Wilhelm, and you watch the master's jaw tighten. The quarterly assessment is a special tax the guild levies on all members to fund various guild activities. Maintaining the guild hall, funding charitable works, supposedly, paying for the elaborate feast days that guild officers enjoy, and generally keeping the administrative machinery running. This assessment varies, but typically runs another 5 to 10 shillings per quarter, and it's mandatory. You can't opt out. You can't argue that business is slow or that you can't afford it. You pay or you lose your guild membership, and losing your guild membership means you can't legally practice your trade, which means economic death. After Walter leaves, without issuing any fines, which makes this a wildly successful inspection, Master Wilhelm sits heavily on his work stool and rubs his face with both hands. 37 years in this trade. He mutters to no one in particular. And those vultures still circle every season. You're learning that even masters, even successful craftsmen with established businesses, live in constant anxiety about guild regulations and fees. The system is designed to extract maximum revenue while maintaining rigid control over the entire profession. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The guild isn't just a regulatory body. It's also theoretically your only path to advancement. See, after you complete your 7-year apprenticeship, if you survive it, if you don't get kicked out, if you don't die from disease or injury or malnutrition, you don't automatically become a master tailor. You become a journeyman, which means you're now a qualified worker who can be legally paid wages, but you can't own your own shop or take your own apprentices. You have to work for established masters, earning journeyman wages, which are better than nothing but still barely enough to survive. And you have to save money toward eventually paying those massive fees to become a master yourself. Thomas, your senior fellow apprentice, has already figured out the math on this, and he's shared it with you in whispered conversations after the master has gone to bed. A journeyman tailor in London currently earns about 4 pence per day if he can find consistent work. After paying for food, about 2 pence per day for basic bread, pottage and ale, and a shared room in a boarding house, about 6 pence per week. Thomas calculates he might be able to save perhaps 2 shillings per year if literally nothing goes wrong, no illness, no unexpected expenses, no periods of unemployment. At that rate, saving the £3 needed to become a master would take roughly 30 years. And that's assuming the guild fees don't increase, which they regularly do, and assuming he doesn't need to spend any of that money on things like clothing, tools, medical care, or occasionally eating something other than bread and bean pottage. This is the trap. This is why the medieval guild system, for all its historical reputation as a protective organization, is actually more like an economic feudalism of craftspeople. The guild masters have already paid their entry fees, established their shops, and built their customer bases. They benefit from the guild's monopoly protections, which prevent outsiders from competing with them. The rules ensure that new competition emerges very slowly, if at all, which keeps prices high and opportunities scarce. Meanwhile, apprentices and journeymen work for years or decades in a system that promises eventual advancement but delivers it to only a small fraction of participants. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds were primarily beneficial institutions that maintained quality standards and provided social safety nets, or exploitative monopolies that enriched masters at the expense of workers. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but from your position as a bottom-tier apprentice, the exploitation angle seems pretty compelling right now. Your education in guild politics continues throughout the day as customers arrive with various complaints and requests. A merchant's wife appears claiming that the sleeves on her husband's new tunic are uneven, and Master Wilhelm examines them with the weary patience of a man who's had this conversation 1,000 times. The sleeves are perfectly even, you measured and cut them yourself, and you triple-checked every measurement because mistakes are beaten out of you quickly. But the customer is always right, especially when the customer is wealthy. Wilhelm promises to adjust the sleeves, which means you'll spend an hour tonight pretending to alter them while actually doing nothing. And then the merchant's wife will be satisfied because she got her way. This is another unwritten rule of the tailoring trade. A huge portion of your job is managing customer psychology rather than actual garment construction. People don't really know what they want. They know something feels wrong or looks wrong, but they can't articulate what it is, so they blame the tailor. Your job is to nod sympathetically, pretend to fix imaginary problems, and send them away happy while doing as little actual work as possible. It's customer service, medieval style, and it's exhausting. Around midday, a young man arrives asking about apprenticeship opportunities, and you get to witness Master Wilhelm's recruitment speech, which is basically a masterclass in lowered expectations. Apprenticeship is 7 years, Wilhelm explains. No wages. You'll receive food, lodging, and instruction. You'll work dawn to dusk, 6 days per week. The enrollment fee is 40 shillings, paid to the guild through me. You'll provide your own clothing and personal items. After 7 years, if your work has been satisfactory, I'll certify your completion and you may seek journeyman positions. The young man, he's maybe 14, from a rural village based on his accent, looks uncertain. Will I learn to cut patterns? He asks, which is actually an intelligent question because pattern cutting is the most valuable skill in tailoring, the thing that separates true craftsmen from mere stitchers. Eventually, Wilhelm says, which means no, probably not, or at least not until the final year or two of your apprenticeship. The master keeps his most valuable trade secrets closely guarded because those secrets are his competitive advantage. Teaching them too freely or too early means creating future competition. So you'll spend years doing basic sewing, hemming, mending, and preparation work before Wilhelm trusts you with actual pattern development. This is another way the guild system maintains hierarchy. Knowledge flows downward very slowly, ensuring that masters remain essential and apprentices remain dependent. The young man's father, who's been standing silently behind his son, finally speaks. 40 shillings is steep. My brother's son was apprenticed to a weaver for 30. Wilhelm shrugs. Weaving is different work. Tailoring is more specialized, more profitable. Your investment will be returned when your son completes his term and can command journeyman wages. This is the sales pitch, and it's not entirely dishonest. Tailoring is indeed more profitable than weaving, generally speaking. But it's also more competitive, more strictly controlled, and offers fewer guaranteed paths to actual prosperity. They negotiate for another few minutes before the father agrees to return next week with the fee. You wonder if they'll actually come back. Many don't. 40 shillings is an enormous sum for a rural family. It might represent the sale of their only pig, or a year's worth of butter and egg sales at market, or money borrowed from relatives that will take years to repay. Apprenticing a son is a massive financial gamble, betting that 7 years of unpaid labor will eventually transform into economic security. Sometimes it works, often it doesn't. After they leave, Wilhelm catches you watching and says, "Don't look so superior. Your parents made the same gamble." He's right, and the reminder sits uncomfortably in your chest. Your family has invested everything in your success here, and if you fail, if you wash out, if you get injured, if you anger the master and get dismissed, you're not just ruining your own future. You're wasting your family's money and sacrificing your younger siblings' opportunities, because that 40 shillings could have been their dowry or their own apprenticeship fee or the difference between the family eating well or going hungry next winter. The afternoon brings more routine work. You're hemming a simple wool skirt for a shopkeeper's daughter, which is mindless enough that your thoughts wander to darker territories. You're thinking about Jack, a fellow apprentice who worked here before you arrived. Thomas has mentioned him a few times, usually in cautionary contexts. Jack made it 5 years into his apprenticeship before he was dismissed for stealing a length of expensive silk. Except Thomas doesn't really believe Jack stole anything. He thinks the master needed an excuse to get rid of an apprentice who was eating food and taking up space without being quite skilled enough to justify the expense. The silk was discovered missing. Jack was blamed, and he was turned out without certification, which means those 5 years of work earned him exactly nothing. No guild registration, no references, no acknowledgement of his training. He's now probably doing unskilled labor somewhere or begging or dead. The system offers no protection for apprentices who displease their masters. This is the sword hanging over your head every single day. Master Wilhelm has absolute authority over you. The indenture contract your parents signed gives him legal guardianship, which means he can punish you physically for infractions. Within certain limits, theoretically, but those limits are loosely defined and rarely enforced. He controls whether you eat well or poorly, whether you sleep on straw or bare boards, whether your training is legitimate or you're simply being exploited for labor. And if he decides you're not worth keeping, he can terminate your apprenticeship and you have essentially no recourse. The guild will back the master almost every time, because masters are full guild members who pay dues and serve on committees, while apprentices are non-entities with no vote, no voice, and no rights. There are technically rules about masters treating apprentices fairly, providing adequate instruction, not working them to death, but enforcing those rules requires an apprentice to file a formal complaint with the guild court, which means publicly accusing your master, which means guaranteeing you'll never work in that trade again because no other master will take an apprentice with a reputation for causing trouble. So you keep your head down. You do the work. You endure the long hours, the poor food, the cold, the casual cruelty, the grinding boredom, and the occasional terror of guild inspections or important customers or mistakes that could cost you everything. You do this because the alternative, walking away, means those years of work were wasted and your family's investment is lost, and your future is probably stitching sail canvas on the docks for pennies per day until your hands give out or disease takes you. As the light begins to fail and evening approaches, you're still working on that wool skirt, and Master Wilhelm is calculating his accounts by candlelight, muttering numbers under his breath. You catch fragments. Guild assessment. 3 shillings to the wool merchant. Candles and thread. The economics of running a tailor shop are apparently just barely profitable, even for an established master with a good reputation and steady customers. The margins are thin. The expenses are constant. The guild extracts its fees. The customers demand low prices. The apprentices need feeding. The workshop needs maintaining. One bad month, one major customer who doesn't pay, one expensive mistake, one period of illness, could tip the whole enterprise into debt. And this is a successful shop. Master Wilhelm has survived for 17 years as a master, which means he's doing something right. Imagine how much worse it is for marginal operations, or for journeymen trying to scrape together master fees, or for apprentices who won't even start earning money for years. The church bells ring for vespers, evening prayer time, and the workday is theoretically supposed to end, but of course it doesn't. There's still the alderman's cape to finish, and there's mending work that needs to be ready for tomorrow morning, and there's tomorrow's projects to prepare. You'll work by candlelight for another 2 or 3 hours, which technically violates guild regulations about working after dark, but everyone does it because meeting deadlines is more important than following every rule. Your fingers are cramping around the needle, your back is screaming, and your eyes are watering from strain and smoke. You have roughly 6 years and 11 months left in your apprenticeship. The guild's iron grip never loosens. Not for a moment. Not for anyone. Your relationship with the tools of medieval tailoring begins on the 3rd day of your apprenticeship, when Master Wilhelm hands you a pair of shears and you nearly drop them because they weigh approximately 3 pounds. These aren't the elegant scissors you're imagining from your modern craft store. These are brutal chunks of hand-forged iron that look more like garden pruning tools than precision instruments. The blades are about 10 inches long, thick and slightly pitted from decades of use and repeated sharpening, joined at the handle end by a U-shaped bow spring that provides the tension. There are no finger holes, no ergonomic grips, just bare metal that you squeeze together through pure hand strength, and after about 5 minutes of cutting through wool fabric, your palm is already developing a blister that will eventually become a permanent callus. Those shears are worth more than you are. Master Wilhelm informs you cheerfully, which is probably true. A good pair of tailor's shears costs roughly 4 shillings, about 12 days' wages for a skilled worker, and they're one of the most valuable tools in the shop. They're made by a specialized shearsmith who understands the precise metallurgy required to create blades that can be sharpened repeatedly over decades without becoming too brittle or too soft. The pair you're holding is probably older than you are, passed down from the previous master, and it will probably outlive you too. These shears will be used to cut thousands of garments, will pass through dozens of apprentices' hands, and will still be functioning long after your bones have turned to dust. The weight becomes unbearable after about 15 minutes of continuous cutting. Your hand cramps, your forearm burns, and your shoulder starts to ache from the awkward angle required to cut clean, straight lines through heavy fabric. But you can't stop. You're cutting pieces for a wool tunic that needs to be assembled today, and the master is watching your every move to ensure you're not wasting fabric through poor cuts. Medieval tailoring operates on incredibly slim margins of error. Fabric is expensive, and every scrap matters, so your cuts need to follow the pattern lines exactly. A cut that's too wide wastes fabric. A cut that's too narrow ruins the piece. You need to be perfect while your hand is cramping and swelling and developing blisters that will burst and bleed and then form new calluses, and this is just day 3. Here's a quirky detail that sounds almost comical until you live it. Medieval shears require constant maintenance, and by maintenance, I mean you're literally sharpening them yourself on a whetstone every few days, and if you do it wrong, you can ruin a 4-shilling tool and earn yourself a beating that will leave bruises for weeks. Thomas, your senior apprentice, teaches you the technique with the grim seriousness of a soldier teaching weapons maintenance. You hold the blade at precisely the correct angle, about 20 degrees, against a whetstone, and you draw it across the stone in long, smooth strokes, feeling for the slight burr that forms on the edge when you're sharpening correctly. Too steep an angle and you'll create an edge that chips easily. Too shallow and the blade won't actually cut. And you have to sharpen both blades evenly, maintaining their match, or the shears will cut crooked and bind up. You practice this on scrap metal first because ruining the actual work shears would be catastrophic, and after about 2 weeks, you're trusted to maintain the tools you use daily. This turns out to be a clever system. By making apprentices responsible for tool maintenance, masters ensure that apprentices develop an intimate understanding of how the tools actually function, and they're incentivized to handle them carefully because any damage comes out of their own hide, sometimes literally. The needles are somehow even worse than the shears. You're expecting something like modern sewing needles, thin, steel, uniform, reliable. Instead, you get hand-forged iron needles that are thick, slightly irregular, and prone to catastrophic failure at the worst possible moments. Each needle is made by a needlemaker who takes a length of iron wire, hammers it flat at one end to create the eye, grinds the other end to a point, and then hardens it through heating and quenching. The process is imperfect, which means every needle has internal stresses and weak points that you can't see until the needle suddenly snaps while you're pulling it through heavy fabric, and the broken end either flies across the room or, more commonly, stabs directly into your thumb or finger with enough force to draw blood. This happens to you approximately 8 times in your first month. You're sewing a seam in thick wool, applying steady pressure to pull the needle through, when suddenly the needle breaks and the tip drives into the soft flesh at the base of your thumbnail. The pain is sharp and immediate, and blood wells up instantly, and your first instinct is to stop and deal with the injury, but Master Wilhelm is right there. "Wrap it and continue," he says, not unkindly but not sympathetically either. Blood on the fabric means you start over on your own time. So you wrap your thumb in a scrap of cloth, trying to stop the bleeding without getting blood on the alderman's expensive blue wool, and you thread a new needle and continue working. The wound throbs with every heartbeat. The cloth wrap makes your grip clumsy, and you're terrified of bleeding through the wrap onto the fabric, which would indeed mean staying up half the night to re-sew this entire seam. This is normal. This is just part of the work. Thomas shows you his hands one evening. They're covered in tiny scars from years of needle breaks and stabs. So many scars that they overlap into a kind of textured map of pain. "You get used to it," he says, and you're not sure if that's reassuring or horrifying. The needles are expensive too, about a penny each for good quality ones, which means a dozen needles costs roughly a full day's wages for a skilled worker. Master Wilhelm hoards them like dragon treasure, keeping them in a special wooden box with a lock, because theft of tools is apparently common enough that security measures are necessary. You're issued 2 needles at a time, and you're responsible for both of them. Lose a needle and you'll be searching the floor on your hands and knees for hours, because the master will assume you're lying about losing it until the needle is found. Break too many needles through carelessness or poor technique, and you'll find your food portions getting smaller as the master deducts their cost from your maintenance. And then there are the irons. Oh God, the irons. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt? This is somehow worse. Medieval pressing irons are flat pieces of iron, shaped roughly like a modern iron but solid metal all the way through, weighing maybe 5 or 6 pounds, with a single wooden handle attached. You heat these irons directly in the fire until they're hot enough to press wrinkles from fabric, which means hot enough that they glow faintly red in dim light, and then you lift this chunk of near-molten metal by its wooden handle and press it against expensive fabric while hoping desperately that you've judged the temperature correctly. Too cold and the iron does nothing. The wrinkles remain, and you've wasted time and firewood heating it. Too hot and you scorch the fabric, leaving burn marks that are permanent and completely unacceptable, which means you've just destroyed material worth more than a month of a laborer's wages. The correct temperature is something you learn through experience and intuition, which means you learn it by burning a lot of fabric and getting beaten for each failure until your brain finally calibrates the visual cues. The faint color change in the metal, the smell of the heat, the sound it makes when you wave it through the air that indicate readiness. Even when the temperature is correct, using a medieval iron is an exercise in controlled terror. The iron has no temperature regulation, no steam, no modern conveniences. It's just hot metal that gradually cools as you work, which means you need to press quickly and efficiently before the iron loses effectiveness, and then return it to the fire for reheating. You're typically working with 2 irons in rotation, one heating while you press with the other, and you're constantly moving between the workbench and the fire, lifting these heavy chunks of hot metal, pressing them against fabric that represents someone's substantial financial investment, all while avoiding burning yourself or the fabric or accidentally knocking over a candle and starting a fire that could consume the entire wooden building and maybe half the neighborhood. The burns come frequently. You brush your forearm against the hot iron while maneuvering it into position. Just a momentary contact, but enough to raise an immediate blister. You misjudge a reach and knock the iron's edge against your wrist. You're moving quickly and your sweaty hand slips slightly on the wooden handle, and your fingers contact the hot metal. These burns are painful, they often get infected because medieval wound care is basically non-existent, and they heal slowly into scars that mark you as clearly as any brand. Thomas's arms look like he's been tortured, and in a sense, he has been just by the normal practice of his trade. Historians still argue whether medieval craftsmen developed higher pain tolerances than modern people, or whether they simply had no choice but to work through injuries that would send contemporary workers to emergency rooms. The answer is probably both. You do develop some tolerance. Your hands become tougher. Your nervous system learns to distinguish between painful but manageable and actually dangerous. And you discover you can work through levels of discomfort that would have seemed impossible in your previous life. But you also don't have choices. There's no workers' compensation. There's no sick leave. There's no safety inspector who will shut down the shop for dangerous conditions. You work injured or you don't eat, so you work injured. The fire itself is a constant hazard. You're working in a wooden building filled with flammable materials. Fabric, straw from the sleeping quarters above, the wooden workbenches and shelves, the thatched portions of the roof, and your work requires maintaining an open fire hot enough to heat pressing irons. The fire is supposedly contained in a stone hearth, but sparks fly out constantly, and it only takes one spark landing in the wrong place to start a disaster. London has major fires roughly every few years, and entire neighborhoods burn because one shop's hearth got out of control or one candle tipped over or one spark found dry thatch. Master Wilhelm is paranoid about fire, as well he should be. There's a bucket of water that must be kept full at all times, positioned near the hearth. There are rules about where fabric can be stored relative to the fire. There are absolutely strict rules about never, ever leaving the fire unattended, which means someone, usually an apprentice, needs to be watching the hearth basically at all times during working hours. You take turns with this duty, and it's simultaneously boring and stressful. You're sitting there watching flames and embers, occasionally adding wood to maintain the temperature, ready to grab the water bucket at the first sign of trouble, and you're doing this for hours while also trying to complete whatever handwork has been assigned to you. The thread and fabric themselves come with their own special miseries. You're working with linen thread for most sewing, and linen thread, while strong, is also slightly rough and prone to kinking and tangling. You spend an absurd amount of time untangling knots that form in your thread for no apparent reason, and the waxing process that's supposed to help actually makes some problems worse because wax buildup causes the thread to stick to itself. You develop elaborate little rituals, running the thread through your fingers to warm the wax, pulling it taut and snapping it gently to straighten the fibers, checking constantly for points where the thread is getting weak from repeated passage through fabric and might break at an inopportune moment. When thread does break mid-seam, which happens multiple times per day, you need to tie off the broken end invisibly on the underside of the fabric, thread a new needle, and continue the seam in such a way that the break point isn't visible or weak. This is fiddly, frustrating work that constantly interrupts your rhythm and flow, and it's especially maddening when you're working on a long, straight seam that should be simple except the thread keeps breaking because this particular batch of linen thread is slightly lower quality than usual, but Master Wilhelm bought it anyway because it was cheaper. The thimbles you use are hand-hammered bronze or brass, not the neat, fitted thimbles of the modern era. They're crude, often slightly too large or too small for your finger, and they don't really protect your fingertips so much as distribute the needle pressure across a wider area. You wear a thimble on your middle finger of your dominant hand, and you use it to push needles through tough fabric, but the thimble itself becomes a source of injury because the rough interior surface abrades your skin, and the constant pressure causes its own set of bruises and calluses. After a few months, your middle finger develops a permanent ridge of hardened skin that corresponds to where the thimble sits, and the finger actually becomes slightly deformed, bent from years of pressure. Peter, the youngest apprentice, is struggling with the physical demands of the tools. He's 12, not fully grown, and his hands are small and weak compared to what's required. You watch him fighting with the heavy shears, barely able to squeeze them closed through thick wool. His face red with effort, and you remember being exactly that frustrated and helpless just months ago. Master Wilhelm shows no sympathy. If Peter can't handle the tools, he shouldn't have been apprenticed to tailoring. The trade doesn't bend to accommodate physical limitations. Either you develop the strength and tolerance required or you fail. The measuring tools are slightly less dangerous but equally frustrating. You're using primarily two measurement systems simultaneously: body measurements taken with strips of cloth or leather that you mark with charcoal, and standardized measurements based on the yard, defined by the length from the king's nose to the tip of his outstretched hand, which is monumentally stupid as a standardization system, but it's what you've got. The cloth strips stretch over time, which means your measurements drift and become unreliable. The charcoal marks smudge and fade. You're constantly remeasuring the same customer multiple times to verify dimensions, and even then, there's significant margin for error. Customers complain constantly about fit issues, and about half the time they're right. Medieval tailoring simply isn't as precise as modern garment construction because the tools don't allow for precision. You're cutting fabric with handheld shears while trying to follow a line drawn in charcoal on material that's shifting and stretching under the blade. You're sewing seams by eye, trying to maintain consistent seam allowances without any marking system or guide. You're pressing wrinkles from fabric with irons whose temperature varies constantly. The entire process is approximation and adjustment, and the result is that even expertly made medieval garments fit somewhat poorly by modern standards. They're too loose in some places, too tight in others, slightly crooked, slightly asymmetrical, but good enough that they serve their purpose and satisfy customers who've never experienced anything better. The workspace itself is designed around the tools rather than around human comfort. The cutting table is positioned to maximize light from the window, which means it's right against the wall and you're forced to lean awkwardly over it to cut fabric on the far side. The sewing stations are low stools positioned near the window for light, which means you're hunched forward constantly, your back bent at an angle that causes chronic pain. There's nowhere comfortable to sit, nowhere to properly rest, because the shop is designed for maximum efficiency of production, not for the well-being of the workers producing. By evening, your entire body aches from the tools and positions you've maintained all day. Your hands are cramped into claws from gripping shears and needles. Your shoulders burn from the repetitive motions. Your back throbs from hunching over work. You have fresh burns on your forearms, fresh needle punctures on your fingers, and a developing blister on your palm from the shears. This is day 3. You have approximately 2,554 days remaining in your apprenticeship. The tools of medieval tailoring aren't designed to injure you, exactly, but they're not designed with your safety or comfort in mind either. They're designed to accomplish tasks, cutting, sewing, pressing, and if those tasks happen to destroy your body over the course of years, Well, that's just the price of the trade. Your hands will be permanently damaged by the time you complete your apprenticeship. Your back will be chronically painful. Your eyes will be strained from years of close work in poor light. These aren't unfortunate side effects. These are the expected outcomes of the profession. Every master tailor you'll ever meet will have the same damaged hands, the same hunched back, the same collection of burns and scars. Welcome to the torture chamber disguised as a respectable trade. The tools are winning, and they'll keep winning for the next 7 years. The fabric arrives on a Tuesday morning in early March, delivered by a wool merchant who smells like he's been sleeping in a stable, which, given that he transports goods by cart and probably does sleep near his horses, is likely accurate. He's hauling several bolts of wool cloth that Master Wilhelm ordered 3 weeks ago, and as the merchant's assistant unrolls one bolt for inspection, the stench hits you like a physical blow. This wool reeks of stale urine mixed with lanolin and something indefinably animal and putrid, and you're fighting your gag reflex while the master examines the fabric's quality as if the smell is completely normal and unremarkable. Because it is normal. This is how wool arrives after the fulling process, and you're about to get an education in medieval textile production that will permanently alter your relationship with clothing. Good dense weave, Master Wilhelm observes, rubbing the fabric between his fingers. The fuller did acceptable work. He's talking about the process that created the smell fulling, where woven wool cloth is soaked in a mixture of water and stale urine, or sometimes fuller's earth, a type of clay, but urine is cheaper and more readily available. Then pounded and agitated for hours to shrink and thicken the fabric into a dense, somewhat water-resistant material. The urine's ammonia breaks down the wool's natural oils and causes the fibers to bind together more tightly, creating fabric that's warmer and more durable than simple woven wool. The smell is supposed to fade after the cloth has been rinsed and dried, but supposed to is doing a lot of work in that sentence. In practice, wool cloth retains a faint urine smell basically forever, especially when it gets wet, which means your customers are walking around in clothing that smells vaguely of piss whenever it rains. Nobody comments on this because everybody's clothing smells the same way. You're living in a pre-deodorant, pre-frequent bathing society where everyone smells various degrees of terrible all the time, and urine-processed wool is just part of the olfactory landscape. You help carry the bolts inside. Each one weighs 30 to 40 pounds and is awkward to maneuver through the narrow doorway, and Master Wilhelm begins the inspection process in earnest. He's checking for consistency in the weave, looking for thin spots or irregularities that would make the fabric unsuitable for quality garments. He's checking the color. This batch was dyed blue with woad before fulling, and the master wants even color with no streaking or fading. He's checking for damage from insects or mildew during storage. And he's negotiating final price with the merchant, because apparently the quoted price was just an opening position and now there's an elaborate dance of haggling that you're watching from the sidelines. This bolt has a thin section here, Wilhelm points out, indicating an area that does indeed look slightly less dense than the surrounding fabric. I'll need to account for waste when cutting around it. The merchant shrugs. All natural fiber has variation. You know this. Natural variation, yes. Poor weaving, no. I'll take it at 3 farthings less per yard. They eventually settle on a price that seems to satisfy neither party, which probably means it's fair, and money changes hands. Actual silver pennies that Master Wilhelm counts carefully before handing over. The merchant marks his ledger, promises delivery of some linen cloth next week, and departs, leaving you with roughly 40 yards of stinking blue wool to process. Processing means preparing the fabric for actual use, and this is where you discover that medieval tailoring involves a shocking amount of preliminary work before you ever make the first cut. The wool needs to be measured and inspected inch by inch, looking for any flaws or weak spots that need to be marked and avoided during cutting. It needs to be brushed to raise the nap, the slightly fuzzy surface texture that makes wool soft and warm, using a teasel, which is literally a dried thistle-like plant with hundreds of tiny hooks. You're dragging this teasel across yards of fabric, raising the fibers, and breathing in wool dust that makes your throat itch and your eyes water. The wool dust is actually dangerous, though nobody in 1340s London knows this yet. You're inhaling tiny fiber particles that will accumulate in your lungs over years of exposure, and many career tailors develop chronic respiratory problems that medieval medicine attributes to bad humors or corrupt air, but which are actually from decades of breathing wool and linen dust in poorly ventilated workshops. You'll start coughing in a few years, a dry, persistent cough that never quite goes away. And by the time you're 40, if you live that long, you'll be wheezing with every breath. This is just another cost of the trade that nobody talks about, because what's the point? Either you work with fabric or you starve. Choose your poison. After brushing, the wool needs to be pressed flat using those terrifying hot irons, which evens out any remaining wrinkles from the fulling process and makes cutting more accurate. You're heating irons and pressing yards of fabric, and your arms are burning from the repetitive motion and the weight of the irons, and you're sweating despite the March cold because you're working right next to the fire. Then comes the linen. Master Wilhelm has 3 bolts of linen in various weights. Fine linen for undergarments and shirts, medium weight for everyday use, and heavy linen that's used for everything from towels to mattress covers. Linen is made from flax, and the process of transforming flax plants into usable fabric is so labor-intensive that it's genuinely miraculous anyone bothers. The flax must be harvested, ret, which means letting it partially rot in water to separate the fibers from the woody stem. Dried, beaten to break up the remaining stem pieces, combed to align the fibers, spun into thread, and finally woven into cloth. The entire process from plant to fabric takes months and involves dozens of different workers. The linen in your shop has already been through all that, but it still requires preparation. Linen arrives from the weaver in a relatively raw state. It's been woven but not much else. The fabric is stiff, slightly scratchy, and covered in bits of plant material and debris from processing. Your job is to pound it with wooden beetles, specialized clubs designed for fabric preparation, which softens the linen and beats out some of the remaining debris. This is loud, physical work that makes your shoulders ache, and you're doing it for hours because Master Wilhelm just received 50 yards of linen that all needs pounding before it's usable. Here's a quirky detail that perfectly captures medieval textile absurdity. The finest, softest linen is made by letting the fabric age for years. Seriously, new linen is relatively coarse and stiff, but as it's washed repeatedly over months and years, the fibers break down slightly and become softer and more pleasant against skin. So wealthy customers who want really fine linen undergarments are actually requesting old linen, fabric that's been used and washed dozens of times. There's an entire secondary market in aged linen, where people sell their old sheets and shirts to be cut up and remade into premium new garments. Your modern sensibilities find this disgusting, but medieval people see it as perfectly reasonable. The fabric has been washed, it's soft, what's the problem? Master Wilhelm has a small stock of this aged linen that he reserves for his wealthiest customers, and you're allowed to touch it only under direct supervision because it's extremely valuable. The difference in texture is genuinely remarkable. This old linen is almost silky compared to the rough new stuff, and you understand immediately why people pay premium prices for it. But you're also deeply aware that you're handling someone's old bedsheets that are being transformed into a nobleman's new undertunic, and the circle of medieval recycling is both practical and mildly horrifying. Silk is a whole different nightmare. Master Wilhelm receives a small package of silk fabric about twice a year, always accompanied by enormous anxiety because silk is spectacularly expensive. A yard of quality silk costs roughly what a laborer earns in a month, and it's fragile and difficult to work with. The silk arrives wrapped in oiled cloth for protection, and when Wilhelm unwraps it to show you, your first thought is that it's impossibly beautiful. The fabric shimmers in the light, the deep red color is richer than anything you've seen, and the texture is smooth in a way that wool and linen simply never are. Your second thought is that you're absolutely terrified of touching it. This silk is worth more than this entire shop, Wilhelm says quietly, which is probably only slight exaggeration. It came overland from China through Persia and Constantinople, carried by dozens of merchants over thousands of miles, and every hand it passed through added their markup. Lady Eleanor has commissioned an overdress, and she's paying £6 for the finished garment, £4 for the silk itself, £2 for our labor. You will not cut this silk. You will not sew this silk. You will watch while I work, and you will learn, but you will not touch it until I decide you're ready, which will not be today or tomorrow or probably this year. The silk commission represents roughly 3 months of the shop's normal income compressed into a single garment, and it also represents catastrophic risk. If anything goes wrong, if the silk is cut incorrectly, if it's stained, if it's damaged by water or fire or the million other hazards that exist in a medieval workshop, Master Wilhelm doesn't just lose the material cost. He loses his reputation with Lady Eleanor, who is connected to half the nobility in London, and negative word from her could destroy his business among wealthy clients. So the master will work on this overdress himself, during the best light of midday, with all apprentices engaged in other tasks that keep them far away from the silk, and he'll take weeks to complete it, working slowly and carefully, double-checking every measurement and cut. You're fascinated by the idea that this fabric traveled from China. The Silk Road is real, active, and moving luxury goods across the known world, and this particular piece of silk probably passed through the hands of Chinese weavers, Persian merchants, Italian traders, and finally a London silk merchant before arriving in Master Wilhelm's shop. The global medieval economy is far more interconnected than most people realize, but that interconnection comes at crushing cost. By the time silk reaches London, it's marked up perhaps 50 to 100 times its production cost, making it accessible only to the wealthiest elite. While the master begins his preliminary work on the silk, measuring and planning his cuts, you're set to working with the fabric you can't completely ruin. Cheaper wool for a merchant's everyday cloak. This wool is undyed natural gray, which makes it significantly less expensive than the dyed blue wool that arrived this morning. The gray is coarser too, with visible bits of plant material still embedded in the fabric despite fulling and processing. You're picking these bits out by hand, which is tedious and makes your fingers sore, but leaving them in would create hard spots in the finished garment that would be uncomfortable and look sloppy. The process of simply preparing fabric for cutting takes hours, sometimes days for large or complex orders. You measure, inspect, clean, press, and measure again. You mark any flaws or thin spots with chalk so they can be avoided during pattern layout. You calculate how much usable fabric you actually have versus how much the bolt claimed to contain, because there's always waste at the ends and edges, plus any flawed sections that can't be used for visible parts of garments. These scraps aren't thrown away. Nothing is thrown away in medieval economy. They'll be used for patches, for stuffing in padded garments, for practicing stitches, for rags, for eventually selling to papermakers who'll pulp them into paper. But they can't be used for the primary garment, so you need to account for them in your calculations. Historians still argue whether medieval craftsmen deliberately obscured their material calculations to overcharge customers or whether the genuine complexity and waste factors made accurate estimation nearly impossible. The truth probably varies by craftsman, but you're watching Master Wilhelm carefully track every yard of usable fabric versus waste, and his accounting seems honest if conservative. He builds in roughly 15% waste factor on most projects, which sometimes leaves him with extra scraps he can use for other work, but which also protects him from running short if the fabric quality is worse than expected or cutting mistakes happen. Thomas is working with a wool blend, fabric that mixes sheep's wool with some goat hair, creating a slightly scratchy but extremely durable material that's popular for working men's clothing. The goat hair makes the fabric coarser and less pleasant to wear, but it also makes it cheaper and longer lasting, which matters more to customers who need clothes that can survive heavy labor. Thomas is cutting pieces for a carter's tunic, and he's deliberately orienting the pattern to minimize waste, playing fabric Tetris with the various pieces to fit them as efficiently as possible onto the available material. Watch how he's doing that. Master Wilhelm instructs you. Pattern layout is where you save or waste money. Bad layout wastes a quarter yard per garment. 20 garments a year, that's 5 yards of wasted fabric, which is roughly 10 shillings of lost profit. Over a career, bad layout versus good layout is the difference between prosperity and poverty. You're absorbing this lesson while also trying to breathe shallowly because the combination of wool dust, residual urine smell, and workshop stuffiness is making you nauseous. The fabric surrounds you. Bolts on shelves, pieces on the cutting table, scraps in baskets, finished garments hanging from hooks. You're living in a world of textile, and all of it smells various degrees of bad, and all of it represents someone's labor and investment and hopes. Peter, the youngest apprentice, is being taught basic fabric types and qualities. Master Wilhelm holds up samples. This is good English wool. See the tight weave? This is cheap wool with a loose weave, acceptable for linings but not outer garments. This is linen. Feel how it's stiffer than wool but stronger? This is wool that's been poorly fulled. See how it's fuzzy rather than smooth? A customer will feel the difference immediately. The education is practical, hands-on, and it sinks in through repetition and correction rather than formal instruction. You learn fabric by touching hundreds of different examples, by making mistakes and being told, no, that's wrong, feel the difference, by gradually developing the tactile sensitivity to distinguish quality by touch. Your fingers become calibrated instruments, able to detect variations in weave density, fiber quality, dye saturation, and finishing that your eyes might miss. By mid-afternoon, your hands are black with wool grease and dye residue that doesn't wash off easily even with harsh lye soap. Your fingernails are rimmed with dirt and fiber. You smell like sheep and urine and smoke. And you're barely halfway through preparing the new fabric for use. This is before cutting, before sewing, before finishing. This is just making the raw material ready to become clothing. The fabric nightmares are real, they're daily, and they're absolutely inescapable. Everything you create starts with material that smells terrible, costs too much, and fights you every step of the way. Welcome to medieval fashion, where luxury and misery are woven together as tightly as the threads in the cloth. The shop door slams open mid-morning on Thursday, and a nobleman strides in with the casual arrogance of someone who's never been told no in his entire life. You recognize the type immediately. Expensive velvet cloak, gold rings on multiple fingers, a servant trailing behind carrying a small chest, and that particular expression of bored contempt that wealthy people reserve for tradesmen they consider barely above animals. Master Wilhelm immediately stops his work and hurries forward with a deference that borders on groveling. And you understand instantly that this customer is both extremely valuable and extremely dangerous. Lord Ashford, Wilhelm says, bowing slightly. An honor to see you again, my lord. Lord Ashford doesn't acknowledge the greeting. He's already examining the shop with critical eyes, noting the works in progress, the fabric selections on display, and he seems to find everything vaguely disappointing. I need new riding clothes, he announces. Tunic, hose, a proper cloak. I'm attending the King's Hunt next month, and I refuse to appear in last season's styles. What follows is a masterclass in customer service nightmare. Lord Ashford has opinions about everything and knowledge about nothing, which is the worst possible combination. He wants his tunic cut in the latest French fashion, which Master Wilhelm doesn't actually know because fashion information travels slowly and unreliably across medieval Europe, but he also wants English wool because Italian fabric is ostentatious. He wants the cloak lined with fur, but not rabbit because that's common, and not fox because his cousin wears fox, so maybe marten? Do they have marten? They do not have marten. Marten fur costs more than most people earn in a year, and it requires special connections with furriers who supply the royal household. Master Wilhelm is nodding and making notes and promising to source marten fur, which you know for a fact he has no idea how to obtain, and you're watching a skilled craftsman debase himself for a customer who will probably change his mind 17 more times before this commission is complete and then complain about the final result regardless of quality. I'll need measurements, my lord, Wilhelm says carefully, gesturing toward the measuring area. Lord Ashford looks offended. You took my measurements last time. Use those. My lord, it's been nearly a year. Your honored frame may have changed, and I wish to ensure perfect fit. Are you suggesting I've grown fat? The nobleman's voice goes dangerous, and you see Master Wilhelm's face pale slightly. Never, my lord. Merely that precise measurements ensure your garments display your figure to best advantage, and I would not wish to rely on old numbers when fresh accuracy would better serve. Lord Ashford waves his hand dismissively. Fine, be quick about it. You're pretending to work on hemming a skirt while actually watching this entire interaction, and you're learning valuable lessons about medieval customer dynamics. The customer is not always right, but the wealthy customer must always be treated as if they're right, even when they're spectacularly wrong, because offending nobility can destroy your business or, in extreme cases, result in actual legal consequences. Nobles have access to courts and influence that tradesmen simply don't, and they're not above using that power to crush craftsmen who displease them. Master Wilhelm is now taking measurements while Lord Ashford stands with obvious impatience, occasionally making comments about how long this is taking. The measuring process requires wrapping cloth strips around the nobleman's chest, waist, arms, legs, and torso, marking each measurement and recording it. This normally takes maybe 15 minutes. Today it's taking closer to 30 because Lord Ashford keeps moving, keeps talking, and keeps questioning whether the measurements are being done correctly. That's too tight around the chest. He complains when Wilhelm is measuring his torso circumference. My lord, I'm measuring where the garment will sit. If I measure loosely, the tunic will be baggy and unflattering. I know how measurements work. Don't pull the cloth so tight. Wilhelm loosens the measuring cloth, makes a mark, and you can see him mentally adding extra material to compensate for the nobleman's interference. This garment is going to fit poorly because the measurements are being taken incorrectly, and Lord Ashford will then complain that Master Wilhelm is incompetent, and there's absolutely nothing Wilhelm can do about it except smile and nod and try to build in enough extra fabric that adjustments are possible later. After measurements come fabric selection, and this is where things truly descend into chaos. Lord Ashford wants to see every bolt of fine wool in the shop, so you and Thomas are hauling heavy bolts down from shelves, unrolling them for inspection, and then rolling them back up when the nobleman dismisses them as unsuitable. Too blue, too coarse. I wore that shade 2 seasons ago. Do you have nothing in deep green? Forest green? Not that green, darker. Master Wilhelm is sweating despite the cold. My lord, I can source forest green wool from the draper near Cheapside. It would take perhaps 3 days. 3 days? I need to begin fittings within the week. I can rush order it, my lord. There may be a small additional fee for expedited. Additional fee? Lord Ashford looks genuinely offended. I'm already paying premium prices for your work, and now you want to charge me more for doing your job in a timely manner? You're watching Wilhelm calculate whether pushing back is worth the risk. It's not. No additional fee, my lord. I misspoke. I'll source the fabric immediately and absorb the rush costs myself. This is how masters go broke. Eating costs to satisfy difficult customers, promising impossible timelines to avoid losing commissions, and hoping that the final payment will at least cover materials and basic labor. Lord Ashford's commission will probably earn the shop a tiny profit margin, if everything goes perfectly, and will consume dozens of hours of work across multiple weeks. But refusing the work would insult a nobleman, so Wilhelm accepts it with a smile and makes notes about sourcing forest green wool at rush prices that will eat into any potential profit. The nobleman finally settles on fabric selections, after changing his mind 4 times, and moves on to discussing design details. He wants slash sleeves, which are apparently fashionable in France, where decorative cuts in the outer sleeve fabric allow contrasting lining to show through. He wants the cloak to fall precisely to mid-calf, no shorter, no longer. He wants silver buttons, not pewter, and definitely not brass. He wants decorative embroidery on the tunic collar, something understated but clearly expensive. Each demand adds complexity, cost, and time to the project. When will it be ready? Lord Ashford asks. Master Wilhelm is mentally calculating, sourcing fabric, cutting, multiple rounds of fitting, assembly, finishing, embroidery, which requires hiring a specialist. 3 weeks, my lord. Perhaps 4 if the embroidery work requires. 2 weeks. I need it for a preliminary gathering before the hunt. My lord, quality work requires 2 weeks, or I'll find a tailor who can meet reasonable deadlines. And there it is, the threat. Wilhelm nods, agrees to the impossible timeline, and makes more notes. You know exactly what this means. The shop will work late into the night for the next 2 weeks. Everyone will be exhausted and miserable, and Lord Ashford will still probably find something to criticize when he returns for his final fitting. After the nobleman finally leaves, taking his servant and his chest and his oppressive presence with him, Master Wilhelm sits heavily on his work stool and rubs his face. 20 years in this trade, he mutters, and nobles still treat us like performing dogs. Thomas, who's been silently watching the entire interaction, speaks carefully. Will we actually get the marten fur? We'll get rabbit dyed to look expensive and hope he doesn't know the difference. If he complains, I'll blame the furrier for supplying lower quality than promised. Marten fur for a cloak lining would cost more than he's paying for the entire commission. You're learning that medieval customer service involves a significant amount of creative fraud, not outright theft or cheating, but strategic substitutions, diplomatic deceptions, and managing expectations through selective honesty. Customers demand things that are impossible or unaffordable, so craftsmen promise everything and deliver approximations that are hopefully close enough to satisfy. The afternoon brings a different class of customer, a merchant's wife named Agnes who needs alterations on 3 dresses that no longer fit properly after her recent pregnancy. She's apologetic about taking up the shop's time, worried about costs, and extremely specific about what needs fixing. This one is too tight across the bust now, but I don't want to replace the entire bodice if we can just add panels. This one needs the hem lowered because I've been wearing higher patterns in the muddy season. And this one has a torn seam under the arm that needs reinforcing. This is the bread and butter work that actually keeps the shop profitable. Simple alterations and mending for middle-class customers who pay promptly and don't make ridiculous demands. Agnes will pay perhaps 3 pence for all 3 alterations, which seems like almost nothing, but the work will take you maybe 3 hours total and requires no expensive materials. The profit margin is actually better than Lord Ashford's elaborate commission, and Agnes won't threaten to destroy the shop's reputation if a stitch is slightly imperfect. Master Wilhelm quotes her a price, 4 pence because he's including rush service, and she agrees immediately, counting out the coins from a small purse. Real money, paid in advance, for reasonable work with a realistic timeline. You're beginning to understand why many tailors prefer serving merchants and craftsmen over nobility. The pay is lower per item, but the work is steady, the customers are reasonable, and you don't spend half your time groveling. You're assigned the hem adjustment, which is straightforward work. You're letting down the existing hem, unpicking the stitches carefully so the fabric isn't damaged, and then rehemming at the new, longer length. The fabric shows a slight color difference where the old hem was folded, marking a line that's slightly darker than the rest of the dress, but that's normal and unavoidable. The dress is blue wool, dyed with woad, and it's seen enough where that the color has faded slightly overall. Agnes won't care about the hemline showing. She's practical and understands that altered garments always show some evidence of alteration. While you're working, another customer appears, a young journeyman carpenter who needs his only good tunic repaired before his sister's wedding this weekend. The tunic has a ripped seam along the shoulder, probably from overextending while lifting something heavy, and the fabric around the tear is slightly frayed. This is more complicated than a simple resewing because the fabric damage means just closing the seam will leave a weak point that will immediately tear again. Thomas examines it and makes a decision. We'll need to patch it from the inside with a reinforcing piece, then close the seam over that. The patch will feel slightly stiff, but it'll hold. 2 pence. The carpenter winces at the price but agrees. 2 pence is probably half a day's wages for him, but he needs this tunic functional for the wedding and he has no other options. He promises to return tomorrow to pick it up, and Thomas sets the tunic aside for later work. This repair will take maybe an hour, requires a scrap of matching wool from the shop's collection of remnants, and represents pure profit since the labor and materials cost Wilhelm almost nothing. The reality of a medieval tailor shop is that you're serving wildly different economic classes with wildly different expectations, all in the same cramped space. Lord Ashford wants fashion and status symbols and is willing to pay premium prices but will make your life hell throughout the process. Agnes wants practical solutions to practical problems and will pay fair prices without drama. The carpenter needs basic repairs at the cheapest possible cost and is grateful for any help. Your job is to navigate these different customer types, deliver appropriate quality for each, and somehow stay profitable enough that the shop survives. Late afternoon brings the worst customer type of all, the one who won't pay. A clerk named William appears asking about a cloak he commissioned 6 weeks ago, and Master Wilhelm's expression goes carefully neutral in a way that tells you this is a problem customer. Wilhelm retrieves the finished cloak. Beautiful work, dark brown wool with a hood and a simple brass clasp, and presents it for inspection. William examines it critically, finding fault with everything. The hood sits strangely, the length is wrong, the stitching here is uneven. None of these criticisms are valid, the cloak is excellent work, but William is clearly manufacturing excuses because he doesn't want to pay the agreed-upon price of 8 shillings. The hood was constructed to your measurements, Master William. The length is precisely what you specified. The stitching is uniform throughout. Perhaps to your eyes, I find it unsatisfactory. I'll pay 6 shillings. The agreed price was 8 shillings, and the work has been completed exactly as contracted. Then find another buyer. I'm offering 6 shillings for mediocre work that I'm willing to accept out of courtesy. This is extortion, plain and simple, and you're watching Master Wilhelm's face work through calculations. He can refuse the 6 shillings and try to sue for the full 8 in a guild court, which will take months, cost money in fees, and probably result in a judgment for the full amount that William will ignore anyway. Or he can accept the 6 shillings, take the loss, and at least recoup most of his material costs. There's no good option. Wilhelm takes the 6 shillings. William leaves with the cloak, looking pleased with himself, and the master carefully counts the coins into his strongbox with hands that shake slightly with suppressed anger. 2 shillings lost. Nearly a week of profit. Gone because a clerk decides he'd rather cheat than pay honest debts. Can't you take him to guild court? You ask, and immediately regret speaking because apprentices are supposed to be silent furniture. But Wilhelm answers anyway, maybe because he needs to vent. Guild court costs money to file a complaint. Even if I win, enforcing the judgment is nearly impossible unless the debtor has property to seize. William is a clerk. He has nothing worth seizing except his clothing, and I just sold him that. I could have him arrested for debt, but that requires finding a bailiff willing to act for 2 shillings, and good luck with that. So I eat the loss and remember never to extend credit to William again. This is the medieval economy in microcosm. Personal relationships and reputation matter more than formal contracts because contracts are expensive and difficult to enforce. You extend credit to customers you trust, and you demand payment in advance from everyone else, and sometimes you still get cheated because the legal system is slow and expensive and heavily biased toward whoever has more money and connections. The final customer of the day is actually pleasant. Father Benedict from St. Mary's Church, picking up the linen shirt you've been working on. He examines it carefully, finds the work acceptable, and pays the agreed-upon price without complaint. Excellent stitching, he observes. Your apprentices are learning well, Wilhelm. This single sentence of praise makes the entire day feel slightly less terrible. Priests are reliable customers who pay their bills and occasionally offer kind words, and in a profession where most interactions range from stressful to actively hostile, Father Benedict's basic decency stands out like a beacon. After he leaves, you're helping close up the shop for the evening, and you're thinking about the variety of humanity that's passed through today. Arrogant nobles, practical merchants, struggling workers, dishonest cheats, and kind priests. All needing clothing, all bringing their own dramas and demands into this small workshop. Your job is to serve them all, accommodate their whims, absorb their abuses, and somehow stay sane while doing it. The customers from hell aren't just occasional annoyances. They're daily occurrences, constant tests of patience and diplomacy, and they're the reason why many tailors develop the perpetually stressed expression of people who've spent too many years being yelled at for things that aren't their fault. Tomorrow will bring new customers with new problems, and you'll smile and nod and do your best to satisfy impossible demands while earning barely enough to survive. Welcome to medieval retail. The customer is always right, even when they're catastrophically wrong, and your job is to pretend otherwise while they slowly destroy your soul. You wake up on a Wednesday morning in late April to the sound of Thomas coughing, and the sound is different today, wetter, deeper, accompanied by a horrible rattling in his chest that makes your own lungs ache in sympathy. He's been coughing for 3 weeks now, getting progressively worse, and everyone in the shop is pretending not to notice because acknowledging it means acknowledging what it probably is, and nobody wants to say the word plague out loud because saying it might make it real. The Black Death swept through London 7 years ago, killing roughly half the city's population in a nightmare of fever and swollen lymph nodes and bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. The plague never fully left. It lurks in the rat populations, flaring up periodically in individual households or neighborhoods, and every cough, every fever, every unexplained illness carries the terror that it might be happening again. Thomas's cough probably isn't plague. It's more likely just the consumption that kills tailors and weavers and anyone else who spends years breathing fabric dust in poorly ventilated spaces. But the fear is always there, humming beneath every interaction. You should see a physician, Peter suggests quietly, while you're all pulling on your work clothes in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas laughs, which triggers another coughing fit. When he catches his breath, he says, "With what money?" A physician charges more for a single consultation than I'll earn in my first month as a journeyman. I'm fine. It's just a cough. It's not just a cough and everyone knows it, but Thomas is right about the economics. Medieval healthcare is largely inaccessible to anyone who isn't wealthy. Physicians train at universities, charge enormous fees, and primarily serve nobility and rich merchants. For everyone else, which is roughly 95% of the population, you have options like barber surgeons who perform bloodletting and tooth extractions, local wise women who sell herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, or prayer, which is free but rarely cures tuberculosis. The workshop itself is a disease incubator, though nobody understands germ theory, yet so nobody takes appropriate precautions. You're working in a space roughly 15 by 20 feet with 5 people. Master Wilhelm, 3 apprentices, and occasionally the master's wife who helps with finishing work. The windows are small and typically closed against cold weather, which means air circulation is essentially non-existent. When one person is sick, everyone breathes the same air, touches the same tools, and shares the same workspace. If Thomas has something contagious, you're all already exposed. The fabric itself harbors dangers that won't be understood for centuries. The wool you work with daily carries fleas, tiny parasites that live in the lanolin and organic matter embedded in the fibers. These fleas can carry plague bacteria, typhus, and various other diseases. The historical irony is dark. The very material that provides warmth and income is also a vector for the diseases that kill medieval workers. You're handling death daily without knowing it, running your fingers through wool that contains microscopic passengers waiting to bite, to feed, to infect. By mid-morning, Thomas is looking genuinely terrible, pale, sweating despite the cool workshop temperature, his hands shaking slightly as he tries to sew a seam. Master Wilhelm notices, and his expression tightens with worry that's probably more economic than compassionate. An apprentice who's too sick to work is a mouth to feed with no productive output, and if the sickness spreads to the whole workshop, that's a disaster that could close the business for weeks. Thomas, go upstairs and rest. Wilhelm finally orders. We can manage without you today. Thomas starts to protest. Missing work means falling behind on skills development, means being seen as weak, but another coughing fit cuts him off, and he nods miserably and climbs the ladder to the sleeping quarters above. You hear him collapse onto his straw mattress, and then silence except for occasional coughing that echoes through the floorboards. This leaves you and Peter to cover Thomas's work in addition to your own, which means you're both going to be working until well past dark tonight. Master Wilhelm redistributes the day's tasks. You're taking over the alterations Thomas was supposed to complete. Peter is handling the basic hemming and mending pile, and Wilhelm himself will focus on the complex cutting work that requires his expertise. The shop runs on a razor-thin margin of labor, and losing one worker for even a day creates cascading problems. Around noon, Wilhelm's wife Margaret arrives with food. A pot of pottage, thick vegetable soup, that's supposed to feed everyone for the midday meal. The pottage is mostly turnips and onions in a thin grain-thickened broth with some unidentifiable bits that might be meat or might be particularly chewy vegetables. It's not delicious, but it's hot and filling, and medieval workers don't eat for pleasure. You eat for fuel to continue working. Thomas needs to see someone, Margaret says quietly to her husband while ladling pottage into wooden bowls. He's getting worse. He can't afford a physician, and I can't afford to pay for one, Wilhelm replies, equally quiet but sharp with stress. If it's consumption, there's nothing to be done anyway except wait and see if he recovers. And if it's plague, then we're all already exposed, and paying a physician to confirm what we know won't change anything. This is medieval medical pragmatism, cold, economically rational, and deeply fatalistic. If you're wealthy, you can afford interventions that might or might not help. If you're poor, you endure sickness and either recover naturally or you die, and that's just the reality of existence. The concept of public health doesn't really exist yet. There are quarantine measures during major plague outbreaks, but individual illness is considered a personal problem, not a community concern. You eat your pottage quickly, standing at your workstation because sitting down for a proper meal break isn't really done. The food settles heavily in your stomach, and you're back to work within 10 minutes. Your fingers resuming their familiar rhythm of needle through fabric, pull thread, advance, repeat. Your mind is half on the work and half worrying about Thomas upstairs and whether you're going to be next to develop that horrible cough. The afternoon brings a stark reminder of medieval mortality when a customer named John arrives to pick up his late wife's altered dress. Except she died 2 days ago, probably in childbirth based on the drawn, exhausted grief on John's face. He still wants the dress because it's good fabric and it can be altered again to fit his sister or eventually sold, and he needs to recoup any value he can from the tragedy. He pays the alteration fee 3 pence, and takes the dress without really looking at it, and leaves the shop carrying folded wool that was supposed to clothe his living wife and is now just another piece of inventory in the endless medieval cycle of making, wearing, dyeing, and repurposing. You've been in this shop for 10 months, and you've already seen a dozen customers die. Medieval mortality is relentless and random. People die in childbirth, from infections, from accidents, from diseases that modern medicine would cure with antibiotics, from simple bad luck. The average life expectancy is somewhere in the low 30s, though that's skewed heavily by infant and childhood mortality. If you survive to adulthood, you might make it to 50 or 60, but those extra years will be marked by chronic pain, declining health, and the accumulated damage of a lifetime without modern medicine or nutrition. Master Wilhelm is 47, which makes him remarkably old, and you can see the toll in his bent spine, his failing eyesight, the way his hands shake slightly from decades of fine motor work. He's survived the plague, several outbreaks of sweating sickness, countless accidents with sharp tools and hot irons, and the general grinding attrition of medieval life. But he won't survive forever, and when he dies, his widow will probably struggle to maintain the business because women can't be full guild members in London, which means she can't legally run a tailor shop despite potentially having decades of experience helping her husband. The shop will likely be sold or taken over by a male relative, and Margaret will be dependent on whoever inherits it for her continued survival. This grim reality is interrupted by a customer complaint that somehow manages to be both serious and absurd. A merchant servant appears claiming that the wool cape his master purchased last week has given the master a rash, and he's demanding compensation. Master Wilhelm examines the cape carefully, and he's clearly trying not to laugh because the rash is almost certainly from the customer's own lack of hygiene rather than any problem with the wool. Medieval people wash infrequently. Full body bathing happens perhaps a few times per year, and skin irritation from accumulated sweat, dirt, and body oils is extremely common. But you can't tell a customer that he's dirty and that's why he's itchy, so Wilhelm promises to retreat the wool with a special preparation that will prevent future irritation. This treatment will consist of hanging the cape in the sun for a few hours and then returning it unchanged, and the customer will probably feel better because the placebo effect works even in the 14th century. Around mid-afternoon, you hear a crash from upstairs followed by concerning silence, and Wilhelm sends you to check on Thomas. You climb the ladder with growing dread, and you find Thomas on the floor beside his mattress, conscious but disoriented. "I got dizzy," he explains weakly. "Tried to get up and everything spun." You help him back onto the mattress, and his skin is burning with fever. His eyes are glassy and unfocused, and when he coughs again, you see something that makes your stomach clench. There's blood flecking his lips. Consumption, definitely. The disease is eating his lungs from the inside, and medieval medicine has essentially no treatment except rest and hope. "Don't tell the master about the blood," Thomas whispers. "If he thinks I'm dying, he'll turn me out before I waste more food." This is the brutal calculus of medieval apprenticeship. You're valuable when you're productive, and you're a liability when you're not. Masters have legal and customary obligations to care for sick apprentices, but those obligations are loosely defined and rarely enforced, especially when the apprentice's family is far away or too poor to complain. Turning out a dying apprentice is cruel but not unusual, and it happens frequently enough that Thomas's fear is completely rational. "I won't tell, you promise?" Though you're fairly certain Wilhelm already knows or suspects. You bring Thomas water from the bucket downstairs, water that probably contains various pathogens itself because London's water supply is famously contaminated, and you help him drink a little before returning to work. The rest of the day passes in grim routine. Sewing, hemming, pressing, trying not to think about Thomas dying upstairs and whether you're breathing in the same disease with every breath. Peter is subdued and frightened, clearly imagining himself in Thomas's place, and probably calculating his odds of survival if he gets sick. He's 12, from a farming family in Kent, and he's already seen siblings die from disease. This is familiar territory for him, just with a new potential victim. By evening, you're exhausted from doing extra work to cover Thomas's absence. Your fingers are sore from hours of continuous sewing, and your lungs feel tight with either imagined illness or actual early symptoms or just the accumulated dust from a day of working with wool. You're eating a dinner of bread and hard cheese while standing at your workstation, and Master Wilhelm is calculating accounts by candlelight, and Margaret is mending her own clothing because even the tailor's wife wears patched and worn garments because new fabric is too expensive to waste on yourself when it could be sold for profit. Historians still argue whether medieval people developed a sort of emotional numbness to constant death and disease, or whether they felt loss just as keenly as modern people but had fewer options for expressing grief. You're discovering the answer firsthand. You're terrified for Thomas, worried about your own health, anxious about everything, but you're also just continuing, working, eating, sleeping, because the alternative is to collapse into panic, and that won't help anyone survive. That night, sleeping in the cold attic space with Thomas's labored breathing audible just feet away, you're acutely aware of how fragile your existence is. Disease is everywhere, in the fabric you work with, in the air you breathe, in the water you drink, in the food you eat. Medicine is primitive and often counterproductive. If you get seriously ill, your options are basically to either recover on your own or die, and the odds aren't great. The fires that periodically consume medieval cities are another constant terror. London is primarily wood and thatch, packed densely with buildings that share walls and roofs. Every workshop maintains open fires for heating irons and cooking and warmth, and every candle is a potential ignition source. Major fires sweep through London neighborhoods every few years, sometimes consuming hundreds of buildings before burning out or being stopped by fire breaks. The Great Fire of London won't happen for another 3 centuries, but smaller great fires happen regularly, and you're living in a tinderbox. Master Wilhelm is obsessive about fire safety because he's seen shops burn, has lost competitors to flames, and knows that a single spark could destroy everything he spent 17 years building. But obsessive caution can only do so much when you're surrounded by flammable materials and working with open flames daily. Accidents happen, sparks fly, buildings burn, people die. Beyond disease and fire, there's the constant lower-level danger of injuries. Sharp tools, hot irons, heavy fabric bolts, ladders to the sleeping quarters, the risk of being hit by carts in the street, food poisoning from spoiled meat, infections from minor cuts, structural failures as old buildings decay. Medieval life is a minefield of hazards that modern safety regulations have eliminated or mitigated, and you navigate it daily with only luck and caution to protect you. Peter cuts himself on a pair of shears during evening cleanup, a deep slice across his palm that bleeds heavily and makes him cry. Margaret washes the wound with wine, alcohol for disinfection, though they don't understand why it works, wraps it in clean linen, and warns Peter to keep it clean and watch for signs of infection. If the wound festers, and many do because medieval understanding of hygiene is limited, Peter might lose use of the hand or, in extreme cases, die from blood poisoning. This is the stakes of a simple workplace accident. You help Peter rewrap the bandage, and his hands are shaking, and you realize he's not just scared of the injury. He's scared of being considered damaged goods, of being turned out as another mouth to feed who can't work effectively, of losing his chance at learning a trade and securing his future. The economic vulnerability of apprentices means every injury, every illness, every setback carries existential weight. As you're finally settling down to sleep, it must be near midnight, and dawn will come far too soon. You hear Thomas cough again, that wet, horrible sound, and you smell smoke from a neighbor's chimney and hope desperately that it stays in the chimney and doesn't spread, and you feel the ache in your own chest that might be exhaustion or might be disease taking root. You're surrounded by death in a dozen forms, some quick and some slow, and your survival is a daily negotiation between luck and caution and the cruel economics of a society that views workers as interchangeable and expendable. Disease and disaster aren't occasional interruptions to medieval life. They're constant companions, background radiation of mortality that you learn to live with because the alternative is paralysis by fear. Welcome to the reality beneath the romantic medieval fantasy. You're not a noble hero in a tapestry. You're a vulnerable human body in a shop filled with hazards. And every day you survive is a minor miracle that you're too tired and too busy to properly celebrate. You're midway through cutting a particularly complex pattern when a nobleman's servant arrives with sketches of what his master wants for an upcoming feast. And as you look at the drawings, you're genuinely questioning whether you're being pranked or whether medieval fashion has finally achieved complete detachment from sanity. The sketch shows a man's outfit featuring a codpiece, a padded, decorative pouch worn over the genitals, that's approximately 8 inches long, embroidered with gold thread, and stuffed to create an exaggerated bulge that would make modern viewers assume the wearer had a medical condition. Master Wilhelm examines the sketch with the weary patience of a man who's seen fashion commit every possible crime against practicality. The codpiece should be this prominent, he asks carefully. My lord insists it be visible and impressive. The servant confirms without a trace of irony. He's attending a feast at court and wishes to demonstrate his virility and status. So yes, you're going to spend several days constructing an elaborate genital advertisement because that's apparently what passes for high fashion in 1340s England. The codpiece, which started as a practical flap to close the gap in men's hose before evolving into this absurd status symbol, has become a canvas for masculine insecurity expressed through fabric and padding. Wealthy men compete to have the largest, most ornate codpieces, decorated with embroidery, jewels, and increasingly ridiculous padding, because apparently subtle fashion statements are for peasants. We'll need wire framework for support, Master Wilhelm mutters, making notes. Extra padding probably will stuffed with horsehair for shape retention. The embroidery will require hiring a specialist. I don't have time to do gold thread work myself. The cost of this single decorative genital pouch will be roughly 2 shillings, about 6 days' wages for a laborer, and it will be worn perhaps half a dozen times before fashion shifts and it becomes embarrassingly outdated. Medieval nobility treats clothing as disposable status signaling, and tailors profit from this absurdity while privately mocking the customers who demand it. But codpieces aren't even the most impractical fashion you're being asked to create. The same nobleman wants polaines, the extremely long pointed shoes that are currently fashionable among the wealthy, with points extending roughly 18 inches beyond his actual toes. These shoes are so long that walking normally is impossible. The wearer must either shuffle carefully or stuff the points with moss or wool to make them curl upward and out of the way. They're dangerous on stairs, impossible to run in, and completely useless for any practical activity, which is exactly the point. Wearing polaines demonstrates that you're wealthy enough to not need to do anything practical, that you have servants to help you navigate daily life, and that you value fashion over function so extremely that you'll accept significant physical impairment for aesthetic purposes. The shoes are technically the cordwainer's job rather than the tailor's, but fashion coordination requires communication between multiple craftsmen, and Wilhelm is taking notes about colors and styles to ensure the shoes match the outfit. The nobleman wants deep burgundy leather for the shoes, which needs to coordinate with the burgundy and gold embroidered tunic, which needs to complement the dark green hose, which needs to work with the elaborate golden codpiece. It's a rainbow of expensive materials carefully orchestrated to scream, "I have more money than sense." Historians still argue whether medieval sumptuary laws, regulations that restricted what clothing styles and materials people of different social classes could wear, were primarily about maintaining social hierarchy or about preventing economic destruction as nobles bankrupted themselves competing over fashion. The laws certainly existed. In England, only nobility could wear certain furs, certain colors required specific social status, and the length of those ridiculous polaine points was legally regulated based on rank. Commoners could wear shoes with points up to 6 inches long. Gentlemen could go to 12 inches. Nobles could extend to 18 inches or beyond. Your social status was literally measured in inches of impractical footwear. The same afternoon brings another fashion absurdity. A merchant's daughter who wants a gown with a train so long that it requires 2 servants to carry it when she walks. The train will extend roughly 6 feet behind the dress, dragging along dirty medieval streets unless constantly held aloft, collecting mud and filth and probably several diseases. It serves absolutely no functional purpose except to demonstrate that the wearer has enough wealth to waste expensive fabric on something that literally drags through garbage, and enough servants to manage the impracticality. The train will need reinforcement at the attachment point. Master Wilhelm explains to you and Peter, using this commission as a teaching opportunity. All that weight pulling backward creates tremendous stress on the seam. We'll need to use multiple rows of stitching and add a fabric backing for strength. If the train rips off during the first wearing, we'll be blamed for poor craftsmanship rather than stupid design. You're learning that much of medieval tailoring involves engineering solutions to fashion problems that shouldn't exist. You're calculating stress loads on fabric seams. You're designing internal structures to support weight distributions that physics doesn't want to allow. You're essentially doing structural engineering with cloth and thread, all to enable wealthy people to wear clothing that makes their lives actively worse. Peter is cutting fabric for the train, 6 feet of expensive wool in a fashionable bright scarlet, dyed with kermes, crushed insect bodies, at enormous cost. The dyeing process alone probably cost more than your family's house, and it's going to be dragged through streets where people empty chamber pots from upper windows and animals leave their waste freely. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. While you're working on the reinforcement stitching for the train attachment, a customer returns with a complaint that perfectly encapsulates medieval fashion madness. A young nobleman's servant brings back a tunic that's too wide in the sleeves, and when Master Wilhelm examines it, he discovers the problem. The sleeves are exactly as ordered, but fashion has changed in the 3 weeks since the commission began. Wide sleeves are now out. Tight sleeves with decorative buttons running from elbow to wrist are in. The tunic, made exactly to specifications, is now embarrassingly outdated before its first wearing. Can you modify it? The servant asks. Wilhelm is mentally calculating. The wide sleeves can't simply be taken in. They need to be completely reconstructed, new fabric patterns cut, new seams sewn, decorative buttons added. Buttons are expensive, handmade from wood or bone or metal, and the whole process would take nearly as long as making a new tunic. I can modify it for an additional fee of 3 shillings, he says carefully, or I can offer a small credit toward commissioning a new tunic in the current style. The servant looks pained. My lord will be displeased either way. Fashion moves quickly, Wilhelm says diplomatically. Perhaps my lord would prefer to establish a standing arrangement where we update his wardrobe regularly to maintain current styles? This is the sales pitch. Convince wealthy customers to essentially subscribe to continuous clothing updates, generating steady work for the shop. Some nobles do maintain these arrangements, essentially keeping tailors on retainer to ensure they're never caught wearing last season's styles. It's lucrative for tailors and financially ruinous for anyone without massive inherited wealth, which is most people, but medieval nobility often operates under the assumption that appearing wealthy is more important than actually being wealthy. The afternoon's work includes preparing sleeve modifications on the unfortunate tunic, advancing work on the elaborate codpiece. You're constructing a wire framework that looks disturbingly like a small cage, and hemming the 6-foot train while trying not to think about the sheer waste of fabric and labor. You're also starting work on a new commission that might be the most absurd yet. A lady's headdress called a hennin, the tall conical hat you've seen in medieval paintings, which will require fabric stretched over a wire frame that extends roughly 2 feet above the wearer's head. The hennin makes doorway navigation challenging and sitting in carriages nearly impossible. And it's so fashionable right now that wealthy women compete over whose hennin can be tallest. There are stories, possibly apocryphal, but you believe them, about women having to kneel in carriages because the ceiling height won't accommodate their hats, and about doorways being modified in noble houses to allow hennin clearance. Architecture is literally being altered to accommodate fashion accessories. This is the world you live in. Why do they wear these things? Peter asks quietly while you're both working on fabric components for the hennin. Because everyone else is wearing them, you answer, which is both accurate and completely insufficient as an explanation. Medieval fashion operates on the same social dynamics as all fashion. It's about signaling membership in the right groups, demonstrating that you have the wealth and leisure to keep up with trends, and participating in the collective delusion that arbitrary aesthetic choices matter enormously. But medieval fashion takes these dynamics to extremes that modern fashion rarely approaches because the wealth inequality is so extreme and the ability to distinguish between social classes visually is so important in a hierarchical society. A peasant wearing noble fashions isn't just committing a fashion faux pas, they're challenging the social order, and they can be punished legally under sumptuary laws. Fashion isn't just personal expression. It's social control, economic display, and political statement all woven together. Thomas, still sick upstairs, calls down weakly asking for water, and you take a break from hennin construction to help him. He's deteriorating. The fever hasn't broken, the cough is worse, and he's barely eaten in 2 days. But he's still alive, which means he's still entitled to apprentice maintenance, so you bring him water and a piece of bread he probably won't eat, and you try not to think about whether you'll be next. When you return to work, Master Wilhelm is examining a fashion sketch that a customer brought in, and his expression suggests he's reached the absolute limit of absurdity he's willing to enable. "They want the sleeves to reach the ground," he says flatly. "Floor-length sleeves that will drag through every surface the wearer passes. And they want them lined with contrasting fabric so the interior is visible when the arm moves, which means double the expensive material for double the impracticality. Will you take the commission?" you ask. Wilhelm is silent for a moment, weighing profit against pride. "Yes," he finally says. "Because if I don't, another tailor will, and I need the income more than I need the dignity of refusing stupid work." This is the compromise every medieval craftsman makes. You serve the fashion demands of people who have more money than sense, you enable impractical and occasionally dangerous clothing choices, you pour your skill and labor into creating garments that celebrate waste and excess, all because the alternative is poverty. You can't afford principles when your survival depends on satisfying customers, no matter how absurd their demands. The day ends with you stitching decorative elements onto the codpiece. Yes, you're embellishing a fabric penis pouch, this is your life now. While Master Wilhelm works on pattern adjustments for floor-length sleeves and Peter practices basic stitching on scraps because his injured hand needs to rebuild its coordination. Margaret appears with evening pottage that tastes like it might contain actual meat today, a rare luxury, and everyone eats quickly before returning to work because several commissions have impossible deadlines and the shop will be working late into the night. You're exhausted, your fingers hurt, your back aches, and you're embroidering gold thread onto a padded genital display that will cost more than your family's annual income and be worn exactly once before fashion changes and makes it obsolete. The absurdity is so extreme it's almost transcendent. You've passed through reasonable reactions like anger or despair and arrived at a kind of numb acceptance that this is just how medieval fashion works. Somewhere in London tonight, a nobleman is planning his outfit for a feast, carefully calculating how his codpiece size compares to his rival's codpieces, worrying that his shoe points might not be quite long enough to maintain his social standing, adjusting his wife's hennin to ensure it's taller than the other ladies' hennins. And tomorrow, you'll continue constructing these absurdities, enabling fashion madness one stitch at a time, because someone has to do it and you need to eat. Welcome to medieval haute couture, where practicality goes to die and your craftsmanship is deployed in service of the most ridiculous vanity projects imaginable. The fashion demands are absurd, the customers are demanding, and you're complicit in creating wearable status symbols that would make modern fashion designers weep with either admiration or horror, possibly both. At least the codpiece is nearly finished. That's something, sort of. You're sitting at your workstation during a rare slow moment, and Master Wilhelm is doing something you've never seen before. He's teaching you basic arithmetic specifically so you can understand exactly how poor you are and will remain. He's using charcoal on a scrap of slate, writing out numbers that represent the economic reality of medieval tailoring, and every figure makes your future look progressively bleaker. A journeyman tailor in London currently earns 4 pence per day. Wilhelm begins, assuming he finds consistent work, which is not guaranteed. That's roughly 10 shillings per month, or about £6 per year if he works every possible day, which nobody does because of holy days, illness, bad weather, and simple lack of available work. So realistically, perhaps £4 to £5 annually. You're following along, though the math is making your stomach hurt. Now, expenses. A room in a boarding house costs about 6 pence per week, which is 2 shillings and 6 pence per month, or 30 shillings annually. That's £1.50 just for a shared room with 3 or 4 other men. Food, if you're buying it daily from vendors and cookshops because you have no kitchen, costs perhaps 2 pence per day minimum for bread, pottage, and weak ale. That's 5 shillings per month, £3 per year. So we're already at £4.50 spent on just housing and basic food, leaving perhaps £0.50, 10 shillings, for literally everything else. Clothing, tools, medical care, entertainment, savings, any luxury beyond bare survival. Peter is listening too, his face getting progressively more dismayed as the economic trap becomes clear. 10 shillings per year for everything beyond food and shelter. That's less than a shilling per month, less than 3 pence per week. for the entire category of other expenses. Master Wilhelm continues his brutal arithmetic lesson. Clothing. A journeyman needs at least one good outfit for church and social occasions. Tunic, hose, shoes. That's perhaps 3 shillings every few years if you're careful and do repairs yourself. Tools. Needles, thread, a sharpening stone, perhaps saving toward your own shears eventually. Another shilling or 2 annually. Guild dues once you're trying to become a master. 8 shillings per year just for membership, plus quarterly assessments, plus eventual entry fees. Medical care if you're sick or injured. Anything from a few pence for herbal remedies to several shillings for a barber surgeon, potentially wiping out months of savings for a single emergency. You're starting to understand why Thomas, who's been an apprentice for 3 years and who would theoretically become a journeyman in 4 more years, looks so hopeless about his future. Even if he survives his current illness, which is increasingly doubtful, his prospects are grinding poverty for decades with a tiny, uncertain chance of eventually saving enough to become a master and possibly, maybe, achieve something resembling security. The masterpiece examination and guild entry fee total about £3. Wilhelm says, and this is the number that crushes any remaining optimism. £3. That's roughly a journeyman's entire annual income after basic expenses, meaning saving that amount would take years even under perfect conditions. Most journeymen work for 10 to 20 years before they can afford to attempt becoming masters, and many never manage it. They work as hired labor their entire lives, never owning shops, never training apprentices, never achieving independence. What if you inherit a shop? You ask, grasping for some path to security. Then you're fortunate, Wilhelm acknowledges. I inherited this shop from my uncle, which saved me roughly half the establishment costs. But even with that advantage, I spent 5 years as a journeyman saving money before I could afford to take over the business. And inheriting only works if you have relatives in the trade who like you enough to leave you their work. Most don't. The economics explain so much about the medieval world. This is why adult sons often live with their parents well into their 30s. They literally can't afford independent housing on journeyman wages. This is why marriages are often delayed until men reach their late 20s or early 30s. You need some financial stability before taking on a wife and potential children. This is why having children is simultaneously essential and terrifying. They're free labor and your retirement plan, but they're also mouths to feed on an income that barely covers one person, let alone a family. Margaret, Wilhelm's wife, joins the conversation with her own grim statistics. A loaf of bread costs a halfpenny on good days, a full penny when grain is scarce. A gallon of ale is about a penny. A pound of butter is 3 pence. Cheese is 2 pence per pound. Any meat is luxury pricing. A chicken is 4 pence. A pound of beef is 6 pence. Fish on Fridays, which is religiously mandatory, runs 1 to 3 pence depending on type. Your 4 pence per day wages translate to about 2 pounds of bread and a gallon of ale, with nothing left over. This is why the pottage you eat daily is mostly vegetables and grain. It's the cheapest way to consume enough calories to continue working. The occasional bit of meat in the evening pottage is a genuine luxury that Master Wilhelm provides because well-fed apprentices work more effectively, but it's not something journeymen living independently can typically afford for themselves. Peter asks the question you're both thinking, so how do people survive? Barely, Margaret answers bluntly. You share rooms with multiple people to split costs. You buy the cheapest food available and tolerate being hungry. You wear clothes until they're literally falling apart. You never get sick because you can't afford treatment and can't afford to miss work. You hope desperately that nothing unexpected happens. No fires, no thefts, no accidents, no family emergencies requiring money you don't have. And you accept that this is how most people live their entire lives. Master Wilhelm adds more context. The wealth distribution in London is extraordinarily unequal. The top 10%, nobility, major merchants, successful guild masters, control perhaps 70% of the city's wealth. They're the ones commissioning elaborate codpieces and floor-length sleeves and paying prices that seem absurd to you. Their annual incomes might be £50 to £100 or more, 20 times what a skilled worker earns. Meanwhile, roughly half the city lives at or below subsistence level, struggling to afford basic food and shelter. You're thinking about Lord Ashford's commission, £6 for a single outfit, which is more than a journeyman tailor earns in an entire year of full-time work. The nobleman will wear that outfit perhaps a dozen times before fashion changes and he needs new clothes. The economic inequality isn't just unfair in an abstract sense. It's grotesque in its specific manifestations. A wealthy man's disposable fashion expense equals a poor man's annual survival budget. What about the wool merchants, the fabric importers? You ask. They must earn well? Some do, Wilhelm concedes. Successful merchants can accumulate real wealth, 10 to 20 pounds annually, sometimes more. But merchant life is risky. You're investing in inventory that might not sell, extending credit to customers who might not pay, shipping goods that might be lost to storms or thieves. For every successful merchant, several others fail and end up in debt. It's higher potential rewards, but also higher potential disaster. The economic lesson continues with rent costs beyond just personal housing. If I didn't own this building, which I only do because I inherited it, I'd be paying commercial rent of perhaps 15 to 20 pounds per year for a shop in this location. That's 3 to 4 times a journeyman's entire annual income, just for the space to work. This is why most journeymen can never become independent masters. The capital requirements are simply insurmountable without inheritance, a wealthy patron, or extraordinary luck. Thomas, who apparently isn't sleeping despite being seriously ill, calls down weakly, "Tell them about the debt cycles." Wilhelm grimaces but explains, "Many workers end up borrowing money to cover emergencies or shortfalls, medical expenses, family obligations, periods of unemployment. Interest rates from money lenders run 20 to 40% annually. Borrow 10 shillings to cover a crisis, owe 12 to 14 shillings a year later. If you can't pay, you borrow more to cover the interest and the debt compounds. I've seen journeymen work for decades, never getting ahead, just servicing debt that grows faster than their ability to pay. This is medieval poverty, not just lacking luxury but being trapped in economic systems that prevent escape. You can work hard, develop skills, make good choices, and still end up locked in permanent near-starvation because the mathematical reality of wages versus costs allows no margin for advancement. Peter asks about saving strategies, hoping for some secret technique that makes the math work better. Wilhelm's answer is depressingly straightforward. You don't spend money on anything unnecessary, ever. No entertainment beyond what's free: church services, public executions, watching street performers. No decent clothes beyond what's absolutely required for maintaining employment. No medical care beyond herbal remedies you prepare yourself. No charity giving despite social pressure. No marriage until you've saved enough to support a family. No having children until, well, you can't really control that, but you pray it doesn't happen too soon. You live in the cheapest accommodation available, eat the cheapest food, and hope you accumulate a few shillings annually that can eventually, after decades, maybe add up to something meaningful. Margaret adds, women's wages are even worse. A seamstress doing similar work to a journeyman tailor earns perhaps 2 pence per day, half the male rate for the same work. Domestic servants earn 1 to 2 pence daily plus room and board. Women doing piecework at home, spinning, basic sewing, earn almost nothing, maybe a penny per day if they work all day. So a woman living independently is basically impossible unless she's a widow with inherited property or engaged in prostitution, which pays better but carries obvious risks. The gender wage gap isn't a modern invention. It's baked into medieval economic structures where women's labor is systematically undervalued regardless of skill. This is why unmarried women typically live with family or in service to wealthy households, and why widows often remarry quickly despite having lost a spouse. Independent survival on women's wages is nearly impossible. You're mentally calculating your own future trajectory. 7 years of apprenticeship with no wages, you're currently about 10 months in, so 6 years and 2 months remaining. Then, assuming you survive and complete your term successfully, perhaps 10 to 20 years as a journeyman earning 4 pence per day, trying to save toward the £3 master fee. You'd be in your mid-30s before having any realistic chance at independence, and that's assuming perfect conditions. Consistent work, no major expenses, no illness, no family obligations, no bad luck. The system is designed to benefit those already established. Thomas calls down, his voice bitter and weak. Masters profit from apprentice labor and journeyman hiring. Guild officers extract fees from everyone. Wealthy customers dictate terms because they control the money, and workers just endure it because what choice do we have? Wilhelm doesn't contradict this analysis. He can't because it's accurate. The medieval guild system, for all its rhetoric about brotherhood and mutual support and maintaining standards, primarily functions to concentrate wealth and power among established masters while extracting labor and fees from everyone else. It's not a conspiracy. It's just the natural result of economic systems designed by people with power to maintain their position. The afternoon brings a perfect illustration of these economics when a journeyman tailor named Robert appears looking for work. He's perhaps 30 years old, experienced and skilled, and he's desperate because the master he'd been working for recently died and the widow is closing the shop. Robert needs employment immediately because he's already 2 weeks behind on his room rent and his landlord is threatening to seize his possessions, which consist of one spare tunic, a pair of shears, and a small collection of needles, as compensation. Master Wilhelm examines Robert's work samples and seems impressed, but he shakes his head. "I can't take on another worker right now. Business isn't strong enough to support additional wages."
"I'm sorry."
You watch Robert's face fall, and you understand that you're witnessing someone sliding into genuine destitution. Without work, Robert can't pay rent. Without paying rent, he loses housing and his few possessions. Without possessions or housing, finding new work becomes even harder because employers prefer workers who appear stable and reliable. The descent from employed journeyman to homeless beggar can happen shockingly fast. Robert tries other angles. "I'd work for 3 pence daily, or take piece rate payment instead of daily wages." He's bidding his labor down, competing against his own survival needs, because something is better than nothing. Wilhelm still refuses and Robert leaves to try other shops, but you know the outcome. There are always more workers than available positions, which means wages stay low and conditions stay poor because employers can always find someone desperate enough to accept whatever's offered. This is medieval labor economics, brutal, impersonal, and grinding. As evening approaches and you're preparing tomorrow's work, you're thinking about the numbers Wilhelm taught you today. For pence per day, £3 per year after basic expenses are covered. 10 to 20 years of saving for a chance at independence. These aren't abstractions, they're your actual future, the specific dollar amounts of your limited possibilities. You're 17 years old, which means if everything goes perfectly, you might own your own shop by your late 30s. More realistically, you'll work as hired labor for your entire life, earning just enough to survive and never enough to advance, and you'll die in your 50s or 60s having achieved exactly nothing beyond survival. This is the fate of roughly 90% of medieval workers, and you're learning that you're not special, not different, not destined for anything better. The economics of starvation aren't dramatic or sudden. They're slow and grinding and relentless. You're not starving in the sense of dying from hunger. You're starving in the sense of never quite having enough, of being perpetually underfed and overworked and one emergency away from disaster. This is poverty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary setback, and it's the defining reality of medieval working life. Welcome to the mathematics of medieval economic inequality, where the numbers don't lie and they don't care about your hopes or your effort or your skill. You can be an excellent tailor and still die poor. You can work every day of your life and still never achieve security. The system isn't designed for your success. It's designed to extract your labor while providing just enough compensation to keep you alive and working. And you have 6 years and 2 months left before you even start earning wages. The apprenticeship suddenly feels less like education and more like unpaid imprisonment with the faint possibility of eventual poverty at the end. Thomas dies on a Sunday morning in early May, which is somehow fitting because at least he doesn't lose work time. You wake to the sound of Peter crying softly, and when you look over at Thomas's mattress, you see him lying motionless with his eyes half open and his mouth slack, and there's a small trickle of blood from his lips that's already starting to dry. He probably died sometime in the night, maybe coughing up his lungs one final time while you and Peter slept 3 feet away, and neither of you heard it or woke or could have done anything anyway. Master Wilhelm comes up the ladder when Peter's crying gets loud enough to hear downstairs, and he examines Thomas's body with the clinical detachment of a man who's seen death many times before. Consumption, he confirms, as if there was any doubt. We'll need to notify the parish for burial arrangements, and someone needs to inform his family in Sussex. Thomas was 19 years old, 3 years into his apprenticeship, and he'll never become a journeyman or a master or anything except another mortality statistic in a century where death is so common that it barely registers as tragedy. His parents invested roughly 40 shillings in his apprenticeship fee, plus whatever gifts and considerations they gave Master Wilhelm to secure the position, and their return on that investment is a dead son whose body will be buried in a parish cemetery with a wooden marker that will rot away within a decade. What happens to his things? Peter asks quietly, meaning Thomas's spare tunic, his eating bowl, his few personal items. Belong to the shop now, Wilhelm says. He died during his apprenticeship term, so technically his possessions revert to me to offset the cost of his maintenance. His family can request them, and I'll probably give them something as a courtesy, but legally I'm entitled to keep everything. This is medieval inheritance law applied to apprentices. You own essentially nothing during your term, and even your personal items can be claimed by your master if you die before completing service. Thomas worked for 3 years, learned valuable skills, and died with literally no assets beyond a worn tunic and a wooden spoon, both of which now belong to the man who worked him until disease consumed him. The parish priest arrives by midday to bless the body and arrange burial. Thomas will go into a common grave with several other recent dead, buried in the church cemetery with minimal ceremony, and his name will be recorded in parish records that nobody will ever read. His parents will be notified by letter. Master Wilhelm will pay a scribe to write it because Wilhelm himself is barely literate, and they'll receive news of their son's death weeks after the body is already buried. They might make the journey to London to visit the grave, or they might not because travel is expensive and they have other children to feed, and Thomas is gone regardless of whether they mourn publicly. You and Peter spend the afternoon preparing for the work week ahead, but the absence of Thomas is overwhelming. The sleeping quarters feel too empty. The work distribution will be harder with one fewer pair of hands. And the unspoken question hangs heavy between you. Which one of you is next? You've been breathing the same air as Thomas for months, sleeping 3 feet away from him, probably inhaling the same consumption bacteria with every breath. The disease can incubate for months or years before showing symptoms, which means either of you might already be infected and just waiting for the cough to start. Medieval life offers no escape from these fears. You can't get tested for latent tuberculosis. You can't take preventive antibiotics. You can't even really improve your living conditions because cramped, poorly ventilated spaces are universal for working people. You just continue working and hoping and trying not to think about the fact that Thomas probably felt exactly as healthy as you do now right up until the moment the coughing started. Master Wilhelm brings up a new apprentice within a week. The boy's name is John, he's 14, from a family in Kent, and his parents have paid the enrollment fee and signed the indenture papers before Thomas's grave dirt has fully settled. The system doesn't pause for mourning. There are always more families willing to gamble on apprenticeships, always more boys who need trades, always more masters who need cheap labor. John moves into Thomas's sleeping space, uses Thomas's eating bowl, and starts learning the same skills that Thomas died before mastering. You're supposed to help train John, and you discover that teaching someone else forces you to confront how much you've learned and how much you've been damaged in 10 months. Your hands are calloused and scarred. Your fingers move automatically through sewing motions that you couldn't have imagined performing a year ago. You know fabric types by touch, can judge thread tension by feel, and have developed the intuitive sense of pattern layout that Master Wilhelm was teaching. You're becoming a tailor, but the cost is written in your body: the chronic back pain, the strained eyes, the permanent dirt under your fingernails, the cough you're developing from wool dust that might be nothing or might be consumption starting. John is clumsy and slow and makes mistakes that seem incomprehensibly stupid to you, and then you remember that you were exactly this incompetent 10 months ago. The learning curve is brutal, and most of the teaching comes through correction and criticism rather than patient explanation. No, you're cutting wrong. Watch the grain of the fabric. Your stitches are too loose. Feel the tension I'm using and match it. Don't hold the shears like that unless you want your hand to cramp permanently. You've become part of the system that ground down Thomas and will probably grind you down too. You're teaching John the skills that might eventually earn him poverty wages. Assuming he survives 7 years of unpaid labor in dangerous conditions while breathing fabric dust and working with sharp tools and hoping he doesn't anger the master enough to get dismissed. The cycle continues because it has to continue. Someone needs to make clothing, and this is how medieval society has organized that production, and individuals can either participate or starve. By summer, the shop has settled into new routines without Thomas. You've taken over most of his former responsibilities, which means you're doing more complex work but also working longer hours. Peter has moved up slightly in the hierarchy and is now teaching John basic skills while also handling the intermediate work that you used to do. Master Wilhelm continues managing the business, dealing with customers, and doing the most specialized cutting and finishing work. The machine keeps running because medieval economy has no time for grief or reflection. There's always more work, always more demands, always the grinding pressure of survival. The escape routes from this life are limited and mostly terrible. You could run away, breaking your apprenticeship contract, but that would make you legally a fugitive and unemployable in any guild trade. You could try to finish your apprenticeship and then emigrate to another city where opportunities might be slightly better, but moving is expensive and connections in your home city are your only real asset in a relationship-based economy. You could try to marry into a wealthier family and hope your spouse's resources provide escape from poverty, but you have nothing to offer a prospective spouse except decent tailoring skills and a strong possibility of early death from occupational disease. Some apprentices try to jump trades, abandoning tailoring after a few years and starting over in a different craft, but that means wasting the years already invested and starting from zero in a new field with the same brutal conditions. Some run away to become soldiers or sailors, trading one kind of misery for another while at least escaping the workshop. A few turn to crime, figuring that theft and fraud at least offer the possibility of significant gains rather than the guaranteed poverty of honest labor. Most just continue, working, surviving, hoping things somehow improve while knowing they probably won't. This is the medieval working class experience. Not dramatic rebellion or tragic death, but grinding, persistent endurance of conditions that slowly destroy your body and spirit over decades. You're working on a wool tunic one afternoon in late summer when you realize that you've stopped thinking about your life before apprenticeship. Your family, your childhood, your previous existence. It's all fading into memory that feels increasingly unreal compared to the immediate reality of needles and fabric and aching hands. The shop has become your entire world. The rhythm of cutting and sewing has become your heartbeat. The smell of wool and lanolin is your atmosphere. You're being absorbed into the trade, transformed from a person with options into a tailor with one narrow path forward. This is how medieval identity works. You don't choose your life so much as have it chosen for you by circumstance, family decisions, and economic necessity. You become your occupation because you have no time or energy to be anything else. The blacksmith is always a blacksmith. The baker is always a baker. And you're becoming always a tailor, your personality and possibilities compressed into the narrow channel of your trade. Master Wilhelm is training you in pattern cutting, which is the real skill that separates masters from journeymen. You're learning to visualize how flat fabric pieces will fit together into three-dimensional garments, how to minimize waste during layout, how to adjust patterns for different body types. This knowledge is valuable. It's what makes you employable as a journeyman and eventually, maybe, capable of running your own shop. But it's also another set of chains because the more you invest in tailoring skills, the harder it becomes to imagine doing anything else. You're getting good at this, Wilhelm observes one day while checking your pattern layout for a merchant's cloak. Another few years and you'll be ready for journeyman work. This is high praise from a master who rarely compliments, and you should feel proud, but instead you feel trapped. Yes, you're becoming skilled at tailoring. You're also becoming unable to do anything except tailoring. The 7-year apprenticeship isn't just education. It's a transformation that makes you incapable of leaving the trade because you've invested too much to quit and learned too little of anything else to have alternatives. Peter is struggling more than you did. He's still small for his age. His hands aren't strong enough for prolonged shears work, and he's developing a persistent cough that everyone pretends not to notice because noticing it means confronting the possibility that another apprentice is dying. John, the newest addition, seems to be adapting adequately. He's clumsy but learning, and he hasn't yet developed the defeated expression that marks workers who've accepted their permanent poverty. The church bells mark time passing. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, dividing your days into segments of labor punctuated by brief prayers that you're too tired to properly attend. Sundays offer partial rest, but there's always mending work and preparation for the week ahead, so you never fully stop working. The seasons change, bringing different challenges. Winter cold that makes your fingers numb and stiff, summer heat that makes the workshop suffocating, spring rain that leaks through the roof onto expensive fabric, autumn dampness that promotes mildew in stored materials. You've been an apprentice for roughly 18 months now. You have 5.5 years remaining before you can even begin earning wages. Then perhaps 10 to 20 years as a journeyman before possibly, maybe, becoming a master if you survive and save and everything breaks your way. You're looking at a timeline of 20 to 30 years before achieving anything resembling independence, and you're currently 17, which means you'll be in your 40s or 50s before owning your own shop, assuming you live that long and avoid the diseases and accidents and economic disasters that kill most people well before then. The no-escape reality settles over you like a physical weight. You're not going to be rescued. No wealthy patron will discover your hidden talents and lift you from poverty. You won't stumble into unexpected wealth or opportunity. You're going to work in shops like this, serving customers like the ones you've met, doing this exact work for the rest of your life, and your reward will be just barely enough to survive and pass the same limited opportunities to the next generation. This is what medieval social mobility actually looks like, not dramatic rags to riches stories, but grinding, incremental, often futile efforts to climb one tiny step up the economic ladder while being constantly pushed back down by forces beyond your control. The system is designed for stasis, not advancement. The guild structures, the apprenticeship requirements, the capital costs of independence, the wage levels, the expense of living, everything works together to keep people in their assigned places generation after generation. You finish the day's work as evening falls, washing your hands in the bucket of increasingly filthy water that serves the whole shop, and you're looking at those hands, scarred, calloused, prematurely aged, and trying to remember what you thought your life would be when you were younger and more naive. Whatever dreams you had are gone now, replaced by the immediate reality of survival and the distant, faint hope that maybe you'll eventually earn enough to not be constantly hungry. Master Wilhelm is closing the shutters, banking the fire for the night, securing the shop against thieves who might steal the fabric and tools that represent his entire wealth. Margaret is cleaning up from the evening meal. Peter and John are already climbing the ladder to the sleeping quarters above, ready to collapse onto straw mattresses and sleep the exhausted sleep of overworked children. You follow them up, your body aching from another day of repetitive labor, and you lie down knowing that tomorrow will be exactly like today, and the day after will be exactly like tomorrow, and this will continue for years until either you die or you're finally broken enough that the trade spits you out as no longer useful. There's no promotion waiting except the privilege of earning poverty wages after 7 years of earning nothing. There's no retirement except working until you physically can't anymore, then depending on family or charity or dying in a poorhouse. There's no escape except death or catastrophe, and both of those happen frequently enough that they're not comforting prospects. You fall asleep to the sound of Peter coughing, that dry, persistent cough that might be nothing or might be consumption starting. And you try not to think about Thomas lying cold in his grave, or about whether you'll join him within a few years, or about the fundamental hopelessness of a system that treats human lives as interchangeable and disposable. This is medieval working life stripped of romantic fantasy and historical nostalgia. You're not a heroic artisan creating beautiful art. You're a laborer selling your body's capabilities for just enough compensation to continue living long enough to sell more labor. The shop will outlast you. The trade will continue after you're gone, and your contribution will be forgotten within a generation, your name appearing in no records except perhaps a note in a parish register. Apprentice, deceased, cause unknown. There is no escape. There never was. You're here until the work kills you or you somehow survive long enough to become like Master Wilhelm. Bent, scarred, exhausted, but still working because stopping means dying. Welcome to the truth about medieval apprenticeship. It's a trap that closes around you slowly enough that you don't notice until it's far too late to do anything except endure. The workshop grows quiet as night deepens around you. Outside, London settles into its evening rhythms. Watchmen calling the hours, distant bells marking Compline prayers. the occasional sound of carts on cobblestones as late deliveries are made. Inside, your breathing synchronizes with Peter's and John's, all three of you drifting into sleep despite the discomfort of straw mattresses and thin blankets and the omnipresent smell of wool and smoke. Your hands rest at your sides, and even in sleep your fingers maintain their half-curled position, shaped by the constant grip of needles and shears. Your back curves slightly from months of hunching over workbenches. Your lungs expand and contract, breathing air thick with fabric dust that's slowly, invisibly, doing its damage. But for now, you rest. Tomorrow will bring more work, more challenges, more grinding hours of labor. But tonight, in this moment, you're simply breathing, existing, suspended between the day's exhaustion and tomorrow's demands. The medieval world continues around you, indifferent to your struggles and your hopes. The stars will overhead, marking time in their ancient patterns. The city sleeps and wakes and sleeps again, its daily rhythms unchanged by individual suffering or triumph. And you, nameless apprentice in a medieval tailor's shop, sleep dreamlessly in the darkness, gathering strength for another day of survival in a world that offers you nothing but the opportunity to work until you can't anymore. Rest now. The morning comes soon enough.